The Iron Throne of Varyndor was built from the weapons of conquered kings, and the man sitting on it had never once considered what it cost to be chosen by someone else's war. Tonight, that changes, because the woman walking down that cathedral aisle isn't just a political arrangement. She's the match being struck inside a powder keg no one knew existed. Stay with me until the end of this story. I promise you, you won't see the ending coming. Drop a like, drop a comment with your city, whether you're watching from Chicago, from Houston, from Manila at midnight. I want to know who's here. Now, let's go. The Cathedral of Solmir had stood for 400 years without flinching. It had outlasted sieges. It had survived 2 great fires and 1 war so brutal that the priests who'd once prayed inside its walls burned the records of it afterward, deciding some history was better swallowed than spoken. Its stone columns were carved from black granite quarried out of the Varyndor Mountains, each one 30 feet tall and etched with the names of every king who had died in service to the empire rather than in retreat from it. The columns did not lean. The ceiling did not crack. In 4 centuries, not a single beam had given way. Vaelor Draven had always liked that about it. He stood at the altar now, with his hands clasped behind his back, his spine so straight it looked structural rather than voluntary, and he watched the great doors at the far end of the nave without any readable expression on his face. Around him, 2,000 witnesses filled the pews, noble houses in their embroidered finery, military commanders in their dress armor, foreign dignitaries who'd traveled weeks to be present for this alliance. They whispered to each other behind gloved hands. They studied him the way people study weather before deciding whether to trust it. He was used to being studied. He had been studied since the age of 9, when his father's generals first noticed that the prince didn't flinch when the other boys did. They'd tested it, the way soldiers test things, methodically and without apology. Fire, pain, loss. They watched him absorb each one and recalibrate without breaking, and they told his father, "This one will hold." His father had believed them. Vaelor had spent 32 years proving them right. He ruled Varyndor the way a mountain rules a valley, not through movement, but through absolute presence. His campaigns were taught in military academies across 3 continents. His legal reforms had reduced poverty in the eastern provinces by 40% in a single decade. His enemies feared him. His allies respected him. His court obeyed him with the specific quality of obedience reserved for men whose anger, when it finally came, cost something real. He had never wanted a wife. He had wanted what every empire eventually required, a southern alliance that didn't depend on trust. The Valecrest dynasty controlled the shipping lanes through the Amber Straits, and without those lanes, Varyndor's eastern trade would collapse inside of 5 years. His spymasters had run the numbers. His treasury minister had confirmed them. The choice was not sentimental, it was arithmetic. Marry the Valecrest daughter, secure the straits, stabilize the southern provinces. Clean, surgical, efficient. He had not asked what the daughter was like. It had not occurred to him that it mattered. The doors opened. The music the orchestra had been playing, something his court composer had assured him was appropriately majestic, collapsed into silence. Not because the musicians stopped, because the sound simply ceased to matter in the presence of what was walking through those doors. Vaelor Draven did not believe in instinct. He believed in information, pattern, recognition, and the disciplined application of force. He believed that what most men called instinct was simply experience operating faster than conscious thought. He had spent his entire adult life quarantining the irrational parts of himself in a place where they couldn't interfere with decisions. The moment Seraphina Valecrest crossed the threshold of Solmir Cathedral, every quarantine he had ever built shuddered. She walked the way a person walks when they have nothing to prove and know it, not gracefully. That word implied performance, and this was something else. She moved with the particular stillness of a river that looks calm from the bank and is moving faster than anything near it underneath. Her dress was silver white, simple by noble standards, and she wore no jewelry except a single chain at her throat. Her hair was dark, pinned at the sides and falling loose down her back, and her eyes, when they finally found his across the length of the cathedral, were the precise amber of a sky the moment before a storm changes the temperature. She was not what he'd prepared for. He'd prepared for a political asset. He was receiving something else entirely, though he could not yet name what. The ceremony began. The High Chancellor read the ancient words of binding, the ones that predated the empire itself, the ones that the throne still used because tradition was a kind of armor, and armor was never optional. Vaelor repeated his vows in the flat, measured tone he used for sworn oaths, precise, unornamented, binding. He watched Seraphina's face as she listened. She was not performing composure the way most people in this room performed everything. She was simply present in a way that made the room feel slightly smaller. When it was her turn to speak, her voice was low and unhurried. "I swear by blood and breath," she said, "to stand with the house of Draven in strength and in ruin, in peace and in the reckoning that follows it. Not because my house requires it, because I choose it." The deviation from the traditional text was minor. The Chancellor barely blinked. But something in Vaelor's chest registered the difference between a person reciting words and a person meaning them. The High Chancellor bound their wrists together with the crimson cord. The moment the knot was drawn tight, the world broke open. There was no other honest description of what happened. The light in the cathedral did not simply change. It shattered. Every candle in the building blew out simultaneously, and in the darkness that followed, something old and massive and entirely indifferent to the comfort of the 2,000 people witnessing it began to move. The air pressure dropped. 3 rows of pews cracked simultaneously down their centers. A sound rolled through the stone floor like a tide coming in beneath the earth. And then the light came back. But wrong. Golden white, rising from the joined hands of the king and his new bride, spreading outward across the floor and up the walls, filling the carved names of dead kings with a luminescence that had no source anyone could name. Vaelor felt it enter him through his wrist, through the cord, through wherever the cord touched her skin. And what he felt was not pain and not pleasure, but something that preceded both. Something that felt like recognition in a language he had never been taught and somehow already knew. He did not move. He did not reach for a weapon. But every soldier in that room reached for one. Seraphina's eyes were open, and she was looking at him, and her expression was the clearest thing he'd seen in years, terrified but not of him. "That," she said quietly, "was not supposed to happen." "No," Vaelor agreed. "It wasn't." The light faded, the pressure normalized. The cathedral breathed again like a man coming back from near drowning. And then the windows exploded inward. The assassins came through all of them simultaneously. 16 points of entry, disciplined, coordinated, wearing black and moving in the practiced silence of professionals who'd done this before and expected to do it again. They were not targeting the king. Vaelor understood that within the first 2 seconds, because the vectors were all wrong for a royal assassination. They were converging inward, angled toward the altar, toward Seraphina. His training kicked before his consciousness did. He released her wrist, drew the blade at his hip, ceremonial by standard, honed to functional by his own hand because he had long since stopped attending any public event without an edge that could actually be used, and put himself between her and the nearest incoming line. "Get her out," he said. His guard captain, Aldrich Vane, was already moving. "The exits are— I know what the exits are. Move." 3 of the assassins reached him before Aldrich could execute the order. The first went down fast, a single redirect that used the attacker's own momentum to introduce his skull to the stone floor. The second adjusted for what he'd seen and came in lower, smarter, with a short blade already moving toward Vaelor's side. Vaelor took the cut, shallow, across the ribs, not deep enough to be dangerous, deep enough to register, and used the close distance to break 2 of the man's fingers before putting him on the ground. The third stopped. Not because anything touched him, because the air in that section of the cathedral suddenly weighed something different. Vaelor turned. Seraphina was still at the altar. She had not run. She had not screamed. She was standing with her hands at her sides and her chin lifted, and the light was coming back. Not the diffuse gold of the Bond moment, but something concentrated, something that had direction and intent. It gathered in her palms the way fire gathers in dry kindling, fast, hungry, inevitable. The assassins closest to her had stopped moving. All of them. Seraphina. Her name in his mouth, and he didn't entirely know why he said it. Warning, maybe. Or something older than warning. She looked at him for 1 second, and what he saw in her face was not rage and not fear, but a specific kind of grief. The grief of someone discovering a truth they'd hoped to avoid a little longer. Move back, she said. He moved back. The light left her hands. It struck the 5 nearest assassins simultaneously, and the word struck was insufficient. What it did was transform. Where 5 men in black had stood with weapons drawn, there were now 5 columns of pale stone, perfectly still, expressions of mid-movement shock preserved in absolute detail. Not dead. Stone. Livingston, Vaelor would learn later, still breathing at a rate too slow to see, trapped in the moment of their last action. The cathedral was silent. 2,000 witnesses stared at the 5 statues. Then, as one body, they looked at the queen. Seraphina lowered her hands. Her breathing was uneven, the first physical imperfection she'd shown since the doors opened. And there was a thin line of blood at her temple, where a shard of exploding glass had caught her. She didn't touch it. She looked at the 5 statues, then at the rest of the room. "I apologize," she said in the tone of someone reporting weather conditions, "for the disruption." The silence held for 3 more seconds. Then every soldier in the room moved at once, because soldiers are trained to respond to new information rather than mourn the death of old assumptions. Vaelor cleaned his blade on the hem of his ceremonial coat, sheathed it, and walked back to the altar. The cut along his ribs had soaked through the white linen of his shirt, visible now as a dark stain spreading toward his belt, and he noted it the way he noted all physical damage, relevant but not urgent. "Are you injured?" he said, looking at the blood on her temple. "Superficial." "The bond," he said. "You knew that was going to happen." The pause before she answered was not dishonesty. It was precision. "I knew something might. I didn't know what." "What are you?" It was not an accusation. It was the most direct question he knew how to ask. Stripped of preamble, stripped of diplomatic cushioning, asking for information rather than for reassurance. She held his gaze. "I don't know yet. And I understand if that's unacceptable." Here is what Vaelor Draven understood about power. It was not the same thing as strength. Strength was a physical fact. Power was a relationship between what you could do and what those around you believed you capable of. He had built his empire on the careful management of that relationship. Every display was calibrated. Every absence of display was equally calculated. He had spent 32 years making sure the world understood exactly how much of himself he was willing to show and exactly where the remainder lived. In approximately 4 minutes, this woman had showed him something genuine, involuntarily, in public, with no ability to curate or control it, and was now standing in the wreckage of that revelation, looking at him with an expression that said, "I know this complicates the arrangement." She had not apologized for what she was. She had apologized for the disruption. That, Vaelor found, was more interesting than anything the dossier had said about her. "Aldrich," he said without looking away from Seraphina. "My lord, secure the perimeter. I want the remaining assassins alive. I want the stone ones preserved and moved to the lower vault, carefully. A beat. And send for the healer. The queen has a laceration that needs attending." He saw Seraphina blink. Just once, the specific blink of a person who has recalibrated. "You're not going to ask more questions," she said. "I'm going to ask a great many more questions," he said, "but not here. Not with 2,000 witnesses and 6 active security threats still unaccounted for." He offered his arm. Not warmly, not coldly, the way a man offers something necessary. "Can you walk?" She took his arm. He felt the bond flicker between them at the contact. Not the thunderclap of the cathedral's first moment, but something quieter. A current. A recognition. He filed that information and kept moving. The weeks following the wedding were not the weeks Vaelor had anticipated. He had anticipated paperwork, alliance negotiations, the particular strain of managing a new political partnership while keeping it professionally sterile. He had done this before with treaties, with generals, with foreign kings who needed to feel trusted before they could be useful. He was good at the management of appearances. What he had not anticipated was the bond. It did not announce itself loudly. That was the disorienting part. He'd expected something dramatic, the kind of supernatural intrusion that demanded response. What he got instead was something quieter and therefore harder to quarantine. A constant awareness, low frequency and ambient, like a second heartbeat slightly out of sync with his own. He knew when Seraphina was awake. He knew, in the way he knew things he couldn't quite source, when she was reading, versus when she was sitting still. He knew when something troubled her because it showed up in his chest 3 seconds before any external evidence of it appeared. He did not discuss this with anyone. He discussed it with no one. But he began, without quite deciding to, finding reasons to be in the same parts of the palace as she was. Seraphina, for her part, had settled into her new rooms in the East Wing with the practicality of someone moving between one difficult situation and another and choosing not to dramatize the transition. She'd requested access to the Imperial Library on her second day. She'd begun meeting with the court's senior historian on her third. By the end of the first week, 3 different members of his staff had come to Vaelor with variations of the same report, that the new queen had a specific kind of attention that made people feel both seen and slightly nervous, and that she asked questions in a way that suggested she already knew approximately 70% of the answer. Vaelor had listened to all 3 reports and said nothing, but he had thought, yes, that tracks. He found her in the library on a Thursday evening, 11 days after the wedding, an hour past the time his schedule said she was supposed to be in the East Wing receiving the delegation from House Aldrin. She was not receiving anyone. She was standing at a table covered in open manuscripts, her hair loose in a way it never was in public, a piece of charcoal in her right hand that she'd clearly been using to trace something in one of the texts. She had ink on her left wrist and the focused stillness of someone who had been reading for several hours and had forgotten to eat. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "You missed the Aldrin delegation," he said. She didn't look up. "I sent my apologies and rescheduled for the morning. They came 3 days from their estate, and they'll be comfortable in the East guest quarters and well-fed at dinner, and I'll give them a full hour tomorrow with my complete attention. What I can't give them is something I don't have right now, which is the ability to sit through 2 hours of trade negotiation while I'm in the middle of something that matters more." She looked up. Her eyes were tired. "Is that a problem?" Vaelor considered the question. "What are you looking for?" She seemed to decide something. She stepped back from the table and let him see the documents she'd been tracing. Old, some of them old enough to require handling gloves that were currently sitting unused beside her elbow. The manuscripts were astronomical in nature. Star charts, planetary records, something that looked like a genealogy written in a script he didn't immediately recognize. "The bond," she said. "I've been trying to find records of it. What it is. What it does." She paused. "What it might do. And it's called the astral tether in the older texts, pre-Empire. It apparently hasn't occurred in recorded history in about 300 years, which means most of what's written about it is extrapolation from older accounts." She touched the edge of one manuscript without pressing it. "What I can piece together is that it's tied to bloodline, specifically to the celestial bloodline, which was supposed to be completely extinct." "And yet," he said, "and yet." Her jaw tightened slightly. "My mother died when I was 4. My father raised me in the Valecrest estates and told me very little about her family. I thought that was grief. Now I'm thinking it was something else." The silence in the library was the kind that happens when 2 people are processing the same information from different angles. "You're telling me," Vaelor said carefully, "that you don't know what you are. I'm telling you that I have a better guess than I did 2 weeks ago, and none of it is reassuring." She met his eyes. The Celestials weren't just powerful. They were, she searched for the word, reality adjacent. The bond forms between a Celestial and whoever the tether selects. It's not arbitrary. It's based on something structural in the chosen person. Compatibility at a level that the texts can't quite agree on how to define. A pause. It doesn't break. Once formed, it doesn't break. Vaelor was quiet for a long moment. "Show me what you found," he said. She blinked, that single recalibration blink again. "You're not going to—" "Show me what you found," he said again. The same tone, same register, because repetition was sometimes more useful than elaboration. She turned back to the table and began walking him through it. They spent 3 hours in that library. Vaelor asked questions with the same quality of attention he brought to military briefings. Precise, sequential, following the evidence rather than his preferences about where the evidence should lead. Seraphina answered them the same way, and once or twice amended her own conclusions mid-sentence when his questions revealed a gap in her reasoning, and he noted that too, a person secure enough in their intelligence to let it be corrected. At some point, a palace attendant appeared in the doorway to mention that dinner had been served 2 hours ago. Vaelor told him to bring it here. Seraphina said nothing, but the tension he'd felt at the edges of her presence all evening, the bond-adjacent awareness that something in her was braced, eased slightly. Just slightly. They ate at the manuscript table, not talking, both reading. The fire in the east wing grate burned low and was stoked twice by staff who entered and exited without speaking, as trained. It was not romantic. It was not comfortable in any conventional sense. It was two people who had been separately carrying difficult information and had, not by design, begun carrying it in the same room. That was something. What kind of something, Vaelor did not yet allow himself to name. The attempt on her life inside the palace came 16 days after the wedding, at 4 a.m. He knew before the alarm reached him. That was the unnerving part. The bond registered distress 3 full seconds before the door to his chamber burst open, and Aldrich was standing there with his sword drawn, saying, "My lord, the east wing!" And Vaelor was already out of bed and moving, already pulling on his coat with one hand and reaching for his blade with the other. "How many?" he said. "At least 4. Possibly more. They came through the servants' passage." "She's conscious." Not a question. The bond told him. Distress, yes, but not the flat nothing of unconsciousness. "My lord." "Keep up." He crossed the palace at a pace that turned jogging attendants into running ones. The east wing corridor was already showing him the aftermath before he reached Seraphina's door. 2 bodies on the floor that hadn't been there before, positioned in the way that happens when someone with training and a clear threat picture works backward from survive rather than forward from follow the plan. Not as guards. Intruders. He stopped in the doorway to her chambers. Seraphina was standing in the center of the room in her sleeping clothes, plain linen, practical, not what anyone had apparently expected the queen to be wearing, with a fireplace poker in her right hand and blood on her left knuckle from a cut she'd sustained doing something manual and physical with it. 2 more bodies on her floor. Not stone this time. Unconscious, bleeding, but breathing, because apparently she'd made a choice tonight about what kind of damage she was willing to do, and it was different than the cathedral choice. She was breathing hard. Her hair was down and tangled. There was a bruise rising on her cheekbone that hadn't been there yesterday. She looked at him in the doorway and said, voice rough, "I had them. I see that. I didn't need... I see that too." He stepped into the room, assessed the bodies on the floor with the rapid inventory of someone who'd evaluated battlefield conditions before, crouched beside the nearest one, checked pulse, checked pockets, registered the specific insignia partially hidden under the collar. He went still. He stood up. "What?" she said. "These men carry the mark of House Solvain." She processed that. He watched her process it. He could see the moment she connected the name to the political geography she'd spent the past weeks methodically learning. House Solvain, one of the oldest noble houses in the Empire, a seat on the Imperial Council. Vaelor had sat across from Lord Solvain at the council table 14 days ago and listened to the man deliver a carefully worded welcome speech for the new queen. "He sent them," Seraphina said. Not a question. He wouldn't have done it alone. This kind of sanction requires agreement from multiple houses. Vaelor's voice had dropped to its flattest register, the one his generals called the still water tone, which meant things were about to become very clear very fast. "Someone on that council believes you need to be removed before your awakening progresses." Seraphina looked at the bodies on her floor. "They're going to keep sending them," she said. "Yes, until they succeed or until someone stops them." "Yes." She met his eyes. The bond was doing something between them he still didn't have the vocabulary for. Not heat, not the warm current thing from the library, but something that operated at a different frequency. Something that moved between fear and steadiness like a wire under load. "What happens now?" she said. Vaelor looked at the mark on the unconscious man's collar. He thought about 14 council seats and how many of them had worn the same carefully welcoming expression as Solvain while signing the order to have this woman killed in the palace he'd put her in. He thought about the bond, what the text said it was, what it had done in the cathedral, what it was doing right now in his chest like a compass that had finally found something to point at. He thought about the Empire, about what it cost, about what he'd been willing to pay. "Now," he said, "I call a council session." He turned toward the door, then stopped, turned back. Seraphina was still standing in the center of the room, fireplace poker still in her hand, bruise darkening on her cheek, blood on her knuckle, and she looked like the most awake person he had ever seen. "You're going to need to be present," he said, "at the session." "I know. They're going to look at you differently." "They already do. They're going to try to use the law." "Then we use it better." She said it without bluster, just geometry. The particular confidence of someone who has already done the calculation and knows what the answer requires. Vaelor studied her for a long moment. He had prepared for a pawn. What he had received was this: a woman who had dispatched 4 trained assassins in her sleeping clothes, who had spent 3 weeks systematically learning the architecture of an empire that had never made room for her, who carried power she didn't fully understand yet, and refused to either weaponize it carelessly or apologize for its existence. The Empire's council met in 2 days. 14 men who believed they could legislate what she was out of existence before she finished becoming it. "Get some sleep," he said. "What's coming will require everything." He turned and walked back into the corridor, already composing the summons in his mind, already mapping the order in which he would dismantle the things that had been built behind his back while he wasn't looking. The bond followed him down the hall like a second shadow. Behind him, in her chambers, Seraphina was still standing in the center of the room, and she was thinking something. He couldn't name it, but he felt the texture of it through the tether, that low, warm hum of someone who has been surviving alone for a very long time and has just encountered for the first time something that feels like it intends to stay. She didn't know yet what to do with that, neither did he. But 2 days from now, Lord Saul Vane would be standing before the full Imperial Council, and the Alpha King, who had never once placed sentiment above survival, was already, in the privacy of the corridor outside his queen's chambers, making a decision he had not consciously agreed to yet. A decision that lived below strategy, below calculation, in the place where the things you actually are make their choices before your mind catches up to them. He was not going to let them have her. The reasons didn't matter yet. The decision was already made. When he reached the end of the east corridor and turned toward the council archive to begin pulling the records he'd need, the message runner sent to intercept him was out of breath and pale and holding a sealed document with a crest he recognized before the boy even reached him. Not Sol Vine, the crest of the Celestial Observatory, a tower that had been closed and supposedly abandoned for 120 years. The seal on the document was fresh. "My lord," the runner managed. "It arrived at the east gate an hour ago. The gatekeeper says the courier wasn't human." Vaelor took the document, broke the seal, unfolded it, read the single line of text inside. He stood very still for a moment. Then he turned and walked back toward Seraphina's chambers at a pace that was not quite running but contained the same information. Because the document in his hand said, in script that was the same age as the library manuscripts and somehow written tonight, "She is the last. The others are coming. You have 9 days." And the Empire had no idea what was already moving toward it. He read it twice. Not because the words were complicated. The words were 7, short, declarative. The kind of sentence that gets written when the person writing it has no time left for anything that isn't essential. "She is the last. The others are coming. You have 9 days. He read it twice because the first reading was the reading of a king, tactical, assessing threat vectors, calculating response windows. The second reading was something else, something that lived below rank and training in the place where a man responds to the world before he has time to decide how a man should respond to it. Then he walked back to her door. He knocked once and didn't wait for an answer. Seraphina was sitting on the edge of her bed, the fireplace poker finally set aside, a cloth pressed to the cut on her knuckle. She looked up when he entered, registered his face, and set down the cloth. "What happened?" she said. He held out the document. She read it. He watched her read it, the stillness that moved through her, the slight change in her breathing that the bond made legible to him in a way he still didn't have clean language for. She read it twice, same as him. "The Celestial Observatory," she said. "You said it was closed." "It was closed 120 years ago after the last Celestial died. Or was believed to have died." He paused. "The closure was official. Documented. I've seen the records. Someone was maintaining it. Someone has always been maintaining it." He said it flatly because flat was what happened when anger was being processed rather than performed, without my knowledge, inside my empire, for over a century. Seraphina put the document on the bed beside her and looked at it without touching it again, the way you look at something you're not ready to fully accept yet. The others, she said. What does that mean? I don't know. Best guess. He considered it. Other celestials. Or something that was made to fill the space where they should have been. The cult activity in the eastern provinces, we've been treating it as political. Splinter factions using old mythology for recruitment leverage. He looked at her. I may have been wrong about what they're worshipping. You think they're waiting for me. I think some of them are. A beat. I think others are not waiting. The room was quiet except for the fire, which had burned down to something small and orange and consistent. Outside the windows, the pre-dawn dark was absolute, the specific black of 4 in the morning in a city that doesn't yet know what the day is going to require of it. Seraphina stood up. She was not steady, exactly. There was a tension in her shoulders that she was managing rather than eliminating, and the bruise on her cheek had deepened from pink to something darker, and she looked like a person who had been awake for too long carrying too much weight. But she stood, and the standing had in it a quality he'd been noticing for weeks. The refusal to let the body's honest condition become a performance of weakness. 9 days, she said. 9 days. Then we need to stop spending time on problems that aren't the actual problem. She met his eyes. Solvain, the council, that was real. But if something is coming in 9 days, the council session can't wait 2 days. It has to be tomorrow. Vaelor looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I'll have the summons sent before dawn. Here's what most people do not understand about power when they are watching it from the outside. It is not loud. The loudness is a surface phenomenon. The ceremonies, the proclamations, the carefully arranged demonstrations of force that tell the world what it is expected to believe. The actual work of power happens in the spaces between those demonstrations, in the small hours and the closed rooms, and the moments when the decision gets made before anyone else knows there's a decision to be made. Vaelor Draven had spent 32 years understanding this. He had built his authority not through spectacle, but through the slower and more permanent work of being right about things before other people were ready to admit they were possible. His council feared him not because of his armies, though those were formidable, but because he had a specific quality of attention, the kind that notices what people are trying not to show, and because he had never once, in 3 decades, allowed himself to be surprised by the same thing twice. He was going to be very careful not to let this be the first time. He sent Aldrich to 3 addresses before sunrise. He had the council chamber prepared. He reviewed the legal archive by candlelight for 2 hours and found what he needed in the precedent records from his grandfather's reign, a mechanism that had been used exactly once, in a crisis that made the current one look manageable and had not been referenced since because the occasion for it had not yet recurred. Until now. The council convened at 8 in the morning. 14 men in formal coats arranged around an oval table of dark wood that had been in this chamber since before the Empire had its current borders. Most of them had dressed quickly. The summons had given them less than 4 hours' notice, which was an insult they would all register, and none of them would say aloud. Lord Solvain was at the far end of the table, gray-haired, patrician, with the particular expression of a man who has spent a lifetime ensuring that his face never commits to anything specific. He was also, Vaelor noted, the only man at the table who did not look surprised by the early hour. Seraphina sat at Vaelor's right. She had changed from her sleeping clothes, had done something efficient with her hair, had covered the bruise on her cheek with the kind of deliberate non-concealment that draws exactly as much attention as full concealment does. Enough that everyone saw it, not enough that she could be accused of performing it. She was wearing deep blue, no jewelry except the chain at her throat, and she sat with the quality of presence that Vaelor had first noticed at the cathedral. Contained, dense, taking up exactly the space she occupied and making that space feel necessary. Vaelor let them settle. Let them read the room. Let the weight of the early hour and the unplanned nature of the summons do the preliminary work. Then he spoke. "My Lord Chancellor," he said, "please enter into the record that this session is convened under Imperial Statute 14, which concerns threats to the sovereign body of the throne." The Chancellor, a small, precise man named Doran, who had served 3 kings and survived by understanding exactly when to write things down without comment, dipped his pen and wrote. Lord Marin of House Aldrich, seated nearest Vaelor's left, leaned forward. "Your Majesty." Under Statute 14, what specifically constitutes the threat? 4 assassins were found in the east wing of the palace at 4 this morning, Vaelor said. 2 of them carry the housemark of Solvain. The room changed, not loudly. The men at this table were too experienced for loud reactions. But something moved through the air. A collective recalibration, a rapid sorting of positions, the fast invisible arithmetic of men calculating how much they knew versus how much they were about to be required to admit. Solvain did not move. That was its own information. "My lord Solvain," Vaelor said, "you'll want to speak first." Solvain looked down the table. His voice was measured, unhurried, carrying the specific confidence of a man who has prepared for this conversation. "Your Majesty, I'm deeply disturbed by this report. If any member of my household was involved in an action against the Queen, I assure you that it was without my knowledge or sanction, and I will cooperate fully with any investigation." "The men are alive," Vaelor said. "They'll be questioned." A pause. Barely perceptible. "Of course," Solvain said. "Under the 14th statute," Vaelor continued, his voice even, "I have the authority to suspend council privileges for any member under investigation for complicity in an action against the sovereign body. This includes voting rights and access to classified imperial communications. This suspension is effective immediately and lasts until the investigation concludes." Another change in the room, faster this time, less controlled. Lord Cassian of House Varyndor, young for the council, 3rd son of a dynasty that had recently accumulated significant trade influence, found his voice first. "Your Majesty, Statute 14 was drafted for external threats. Applying it to a council member on the basis of preliminary, the statute does not specify external," Vaelor said. "Read it." "I am familiar with the statute." "Then you know what it says." He looked at Cassian without heat, without particular pressure, just the flat attention of a man who has already made the decision and is now simply watching the room acknowledge it. "Is there anyone at this table who wants to contest the legality on the record?" Silence. Solvain's eyes moved to Seraphina. Just once. For less than 2 seconds. But Vaelor caught it, and Vaelor held it in memory the way he held all useful information, accurately, without embellishment, for later use. Seraphina caught it too. He knew because the bond told him. Not the specifics. He still didn't receive thoughts through it, only the emotional texture of things. What he felt from her in that moment was not fear. It was colder than fear and more deliberate. The specific sensation of someone who has decided to remember a thing. "There is a second matter," Vaelor said. He placed the observatory document on the table. He let them read it. He watched the sequence of expressions that moved across the room. The confusion, the calculation, the attempts to reconstruct context from a single data point. And then, in 2 faces, he noted carefully, something that looked less like confusion and more like a very rapid attempt to look confused. Lord Payne of House Aldenmore, Lord Cassian of House Varyndor. Both of them were looking at the document. Both of them were performing the correct expression of bewilderment, but their breathing had changed. Vaelor was good at breathing. "The Celestial Observatory," he said, "has been active for at minimum 120 years under the authority of parties currently unknown, inside the borders of this empire, using infrastructure that belongs to the crown." He paused. "I'm going to assume, for the purpose of this session, that no one at this table has information about this that they've been withholding from their king. I'm going to make that assumption for approximately the next 48 hours, after which I'm going to stop being interested in what anyone assumed I didn't need to know and start being interested exclusively in what they chose not to tell me." The room was very quiet. "This document," he continued, "indicates that something is coming toward the Empire in 9 days. The Queen's nature has been established publicly. There are factions who want her eliminated before she can be understood. There are factions who appear to have been waiting for her to exist." He looked at the table. "Both of those positions are now threats to imperial stability, and I will treat them accordingly." Lord Payne said carefully, "Your Majesty, the Queen's awakening, the cathedral. There are those who believe that the risk she represents is my concern," Vaelor said, "not the Council's. With respect, the Council has a mandate to advise, not to authorize assassinations in the East Wing. Payne's mouth closed. Vaelor stood. This session is adjourned. Solvain's suspension is effective as of this moment. I'll have the investigation timeline communicated by end of day. Anyone with information relevant to the observatory document will bring it to me directly within the 48-hour window I've described. After that window, I will not be offering options. He straightened his coat. We're done here. He walked out. Seraphina walked beside him, one step back and to his right, which was the formal positioning for a consort in a council session, and which she had maintained throughout the entire meeting with the precision of someone who had memorized the protocol and understood exactly what adherence to it communicated. She hadn't spoken once. She hadn't needed to. Her presence at that table, bruised and steady and watching every man in the room with the particular attention of someone building an inventory, had been its own statement. They were halfway down the main corridor before she spoke. Payne and Cassian, she said. Yes. You saw it too. Breathing, he said. Breathing, she agreed. A pause. What happens to them? That depends on what the observatory messenger is willing to tell us. She glanced at him. You know where it is. I know where every building in my empire is. That's not what I meant. He looked at her sideways. We're going tonight, before whatever is coming has time to disappear. She nodded. Not surprised, not relieved, just noted, committed, moving forward. This was something he had been watching in her for 3 weeks and had not yet said anything about, because it operated on a frequency that he couldn't address without naming it, and naming it required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it meant something he hadn't finished deciding yet. What it was, she moved through difficulty the way water moves through rock, not by force, not by drama, but by sustained and patient pressure that simply continues until the obstacle has no choice but to accommodate it. He had met people who were brave. He had met people who were strategic. He had not, in 32 years, met someone who managed to be both in a way that looked like simple presence rather than effort. He did not say this. He kept walking. The Celestial Observatory sat at the edge of the old city, the part of Varyndor's capital that predated the Empire's current form, where the streets were narrow and the buildings were built from a darker stone than the rest of the city used, where people who'd lived in the district long enough moved through the alleys without consulting the geography because it was stored in their muscles instead of their minds. The observatory had been closed to the public for a century and a quarter. Its official record described a building sealed by imperial order, its contents catalogued and stored, its staff dispersed. Vaelor had seen those records twice, once when he first took the throne, reviewing the historical inventory of crown properties, and once 3 years later during a taxation audit that required verifying the status of all non-operational imperial assets. Both times, the records had appeared complete. Both times, he'd had no reason to look closer. The building that greeted them at midnight, with Aldrich and 4 soldiers flanking at distance, and Seraphina walking beside him in a dark coat she'd acquired from somewhere that did not appear to be her official wardrobe, was not sealed. It was lit, not loudly, no fires visible from the street, no lanterns in the windows. But there was light inside, deep and faint and moving in the particular way light moves when there is breath and warmth and sustained habitation. Someone lived here. Someone had been living here for a long time. Vaelor tried the door. It opened. The interior was nothing like an abandoned building. The floors were clean. The instruments, and there were instruments, things on tables and mounted to walls, and suspended from ceiling fixtures that occupied a category somewhere between the mechanical and the inexplicable, were maintained. The star charts on the walls were current, not reproductions of old work. Current, updated within what looked like days. A woman was sitting at a desk at the far end of the main room. She was old in the way that certain things are old, not frail, not declining, but accumulated, like she had simply continued past the point where most things stop and had organized that continuation into something functional. Her hair was white and worn loose, and her eyes when she looked up at them were the specific amber that Vaelor had only seen once before, in Seraphina. "You took longer than I expected," the old woman said, not unkindly, factually. "Who are you?" Vaelor said. "My name is Aurea. I've been here since before your grandfather was born." She looked at Seraphina. Not with warmth, exactly, with something that was trying to be restraint and was not quite succeeding. "You look like your mother." The air in the room changed. Seraphina's breathing changed. Vaelor felt it through the bond before he heard it. A shift. Something opening and bracing at the same time. The sensation of a door you haven't touched in years being reached for. "You knew her," Seraphina said. "I trained her." Oria's voice was even, but something moved behind it. "As I trained the one before her. As I trained the ones before that. Back through 6 generations, watching each one burn bright and then burn out and then beginning again." She paused. "You are the last. The line ends with you, or it continues with you. There is no more after this." "The others coming," Vaelor said. "What are they?" Oria looked at him with the assessment of someone who has been evaluating people for long enough that it has become involuntary. "The Shorn," she said. "They are what happens to a celestial bloodline that is not allowed to mature. They were the ones who broke the first dynasty 3 centuries ago. They've been reforming in the East for 40 years, and they know what Seraphina is, and they want what she carries." "They want her power," Seraphina said. "They want your awakening. The power isn't transferable. They know that. But the process of the awakening produces what they need." Oria's tone remained factual, which made it worse. "They will pull you apart while the transformation is happening to harvest what is released. You will not survive it, and what they harvest will not make them better. It will make them capable of worse." The room was very still. Vaelor let the information settle without reacting to it. This was a discipline he had built over decades. The ability to receive terrible news as data first, response second, because the response that comes before the processing is almost always wrong. 9 days. He had 9 days to understand what the Shorn were, how they moved, what their numbers looked like, and how to position against them without knowing what they were fully capable of. He had 9 days to manage a council with, at minimum, 2 compromised members, a suspended lord, and 14 men who had just watched their king apply a mechanism they'd never expected to see used. He had 9 days while the bond between him and Seraphina continued deepening in ways that neither of them could yet fully read, and while Seraphina's awakening proceeded on a timeline that didn't care about any of the above. "The awakening," he said to Oria. "How does it progress?" "Faster now that it's begun. The tether accelerates it." She looked at him steadily. "You accelerate it. The bond feeds from proximity, from emotional resonance, every time she draws on it." "I know," Seraphina said. Quiet. Firm. Oria looked at her. "I know," she said again. "I've been reading. I understand the mechanism." She paused. "I need to know how to survive the final stage without losing myself." "That," Oria said, "is the question no celestial before you has managed to answer. Then I'll need to be the first one who does." There was something in Seraphina's voice when she said it that was not bravado. Vaelor had been in enough rooms with enough people who were bluffing to know the difference. This was not the confidence of someone who believed it was certain. This was the confidence of someone who had decided that the alternative was not acceptable, and that decision had made the fear beside the point. He recognized it. He had used it himself, on worse days than this. Oria began to talk. She talked for 2 hours, and what she said reorganized everything Vaelor thought he understood about the history of his empire. The Celestials had not simply gone extinct. They had been hunted, systematically, through 3 generations, by a coalition of interests that included noble houses, foreign powers, and the specific faction that had eventually become the Shorn. The last of the line had been hidden. A child, a girl, taken south and placed with a loyal house and given a different name, and left to grow up believing her bloodline was simply tragic rather than deliberately erased. That child had grown up and had died young and had left a daughter. Seraphina listened to this with her hands in her lap and her face very still. Vaelor watched her. There is a specific kind of grief that has no performance to it, not because the person feeling it is suppressing the display, but because the information is so large that the body doesn't have an immediate template for it. It is the grief of retroactive understanding, the kind that rewrites what you thought you knew about your own story, while you're sitting in a room listening to someone who has been holding the real version for a generation. He had felt something like it once, when he was 19 and learned the actual circumstances of his mother's death. Not the version his father had maintained, clean and respectful, But the actual circumstances, hard and specific, and making everything he'd believed about his childhood fit differently once he knew. He had sat very still then, too. Across the table, Seraphina was sitting still in exactly the same way, not performing composure, simply inhabiting the only option that was available when grief is too big for the immediate moment. At some point, his hand was on the table between them. He didn't entirely remember deciding to move it there. It was simply there, within reach, not demanding anything, not signaling anything in particular. An offer of the most basic and nonverbal kind. I am in the room. I am not leaving. She looked at his hand, then at him. She put her hand over his. Just for a moment. Pressure without grip, presence without claim. The bond did something between them that neither of them acknowledged. They walked back to the palace before dawn, Oria's promised documents in Vaelor's coat pocket. The city still dark around them, the streets empty except for the particular early morning silence of a place that doesn't yet know it's been changed. He was running through the math again. The Shorn's timeline, 9 days. The council, 2 compromised members, 1 suspended, 12 remaining, whose loyalty was now a variable rather than an assumption. The awakening, accelerating, uncontrollable in its sequence, survivable only if someone managed something no predecessor had managed. His military, strong, positioned, but calibrated for human opposition, not for whatever the Shorn brought with them. And the bond, deepening every day, giving him information he didn't have the framework to process about a woman who had been managing alone for a very long time and was still, even now, choosing to do so as a first instinct before reconsidering. He thought about what Oria had said. The tether accelerates it, every time she draws on it. He thought about the document, 9 days. He thought about the council chamber that morning, Solvain's still face and Payne's controlled breathing, and Cassian's practiced confusion, and the specific anger he felt about all 3 of them that was clean and clear and useful in the way that well-directed anger is always useful. They reached the palace gates. Aldrich fell back to speak to the gate guard, giving them 20 feet of space. Seraphina stopped walking. Vaelor stopped beside her. She was looking at the palace, at the lit windows of the east wing, at the silhouette of the guards on the wall, at the place she had been moved into like a piece on a game board 3 weeks ago and had proceeded to make her own by the force of sustained and unperformable will. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. The last stage of the awakening. She didn't look at him. She was still looking at the palace. Oria confirmed what I found in the texts. When it comes, and it will come faster now, she's right about that, I won't be able to control what happens around me. Reality. She paused on the word, choosing it deliberately. Reality responds to a celestial in full awakening the same way weather responds to heat. Won't be trying to destroy anything. But the difference between intent and consequence at that level, I understand, he said. I don't think you do. Not yet. Now she looked at him. The amber eyes, the bruise on her cheek, the tiredness that she never let become frailty. I'm telling you now because you deserve to make an informed decision about what you're willing to stand next to. If you want to put distance between yourself and what's coming, I won't call that a failure. I'll call it reasonable. He looked at her for a long moment. I dissolve the council, he said, or I stand next to something I don't fully understand that is not trying to hurt anything. She blinked. Tell me which one, he said. Sounds like the harder choice. Something crossed her face that he had not seen there before. Not warmth. Warmth was too soft a word. Something structural. Something that had been waiting for a piece that fit and had now found it and was adjusting to accommodate the new weight. She didn't say anything. She walked through the gate. He walked beside her. Inside the palace, in the lower vault, 2 interrogators were preparing to question 4 men with the mark of House Solvain on their collars. Inside the council archive, a chancellor's clerk was preparing the formal suspension document. In Vaelor's coat pocket, Oria's documents described in detail what the Shorn had done to every celestial they'd ever reached. And in the eastern provinces, 9 days out, something that had been waiting for a very long time turned its collective attention toward the capital. Vaelor went to his study. He opened the documents from Oria. He read the first page. Then he stopped. and reread the same paragraph 3 times, with the particular careful attention he gave to information that was going to change what he did next. Because what Aurea had written in the section describing the Shorn's capabilities included a detail that had not appeared in any intelligence report he'd received in the past 2 years. A detail that meant the military positioning he'd been calculating since 4 in the morning was wrong. Not slightly wrong, but structurally wrong. The way a building is wrong when the foundation is placed incorrectly. It didn't matter how good the structure above it was. It would fall. He reached for the bell to summon Aldrich, then stopped, because the paragraph also contained a second detail. Smaller. Buried in description. Easy to miss. The Shorn did not move on Celestials directly. Not initially. They moved on the tether. They would not come for Seraphina first. They would come for him. He read the paragraph a 4th time. Not because the words changed. Words never changed. That was the particular cruelty of written information. It sat there and said the same thing regardless of how many times you approached it, hoping for a different answer. The Shorn do not move on the Celestial directly in the initial phase. The tether is the vulnerability. The bonded partner carries a resonant signature that can be located, isolated, and severed. Severance of the tether during active awakening does not neutralize the Celestial. It destabilizes her. An unstabilized Celestial in mid-awakening is not a weapon anyone controls. She becomes the disaster itself. They would not come for Seraphina first. They would come for him. Vaelor set the document down on his desk with the careful precision of a man handling something he does not want to drop. He looked at the wall across the study, at the campaign map that had been pinned there for 3 months, tracking the Eastern Province unrest with the colored markers his generals used, red for confirmed hostility, yellow for suspected, green for stable. He looked at how much red there was. He looked at where the red was concentrated, and he thought about the Shorn's timeline, and he thought about the specific geometry of what Aurea's document had just told him. They didn't need to breach the palace walls. They didn't need to put a blade in him directly. They needed to get close enough to sever a bond. A resonant severance, Aurea's text said, which required proximity but not contact, and then step back and watch the Empire unmake itself from the inside out. He had been defending the wrong perimeter. He sat with that for 60 seconds. 60 seconds was what he allowed himself for the processing of information that required restructuring everything built on the assumption it replaced. It was not a generous allowance, but it was what he had. Then he picked up the bell and summoned Aldrich. Aldrich arrived in 4 minutes, which meant he had not gone to bed. His coat was on and his sword was at his hip, and his face had the specific quality of a man who has been awake for 20 hours and has made peace with the possibility of 40. "I need the defensive perimeter restructured," Vaelor said. "Everything we've built assumes an external threat moving on the east wing. I need you to think about it differently. They're not moving on the east wing." Aldrich looked at him. "My lord, they're moving on me. Any positioning that protects Seraphina by keeping threat away from her is wrong. I need positioning that keeps threat away from both of us simultaneously, which is a different problem." He paused. "Close formation. No separation protocols. Wherever she is, I need to be within 20 feet. Aldrich processed this without visible reaction, which was one of his more valuable qualities. That limits your operational range. "I know. The council session tomorrow. Postponed. Send word before 8. He looked at the map. "I need everything on the Shorn you can pull from the Eastern intelligence files, not the summary reports, the raw dispatches. I want the language the field agents used before the analysts decided what was relevant. That will take until morning." "Then bring it at morning." Aldrich moved to leave. "Aldrich." He stopped. Vaelor did not turn from the map. "The interrogation of Solvain's men. What did we get?" A pause behind him. "They're not talking," Aldrich said. "The two who are conscious, they're not talking. Apply pressure." "We have been." Vaelor turned. He looked at Aldrich's face, and what he saw there was not hesitation. Aldrich did not hesitate. It was not in his construction, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has information he is deciding how to carry. "What else?" Vaelor said. "One of them," Aldrich said carefully, "asked to speak to the Queen." The study was quiet. "Not to me," Vaelor said. "No." He was specific. Vaelor considered this for 3 seconds. "At first light, with me present." "Yes, my lord." Aldrich left. Vaelor turned back to the map. He stood there for a long time, not moving, looking at the red markers and thinking about perimeters and proximity and the specific vulnerability of being bonded to something the enemy understood better than you did. There is a thing that happens to men who have been powerful for a long time. It is not arrogance exactly. Arrogance is too simple a word for it, too surface. What happens is more structural. The architecture of a man who has always been the most dangerous thing in a given room begins to include, quietly and without announcement, the assumption that this will continue, not because he believes himself invincible, but because the evidence of 32 years has never once suggested otherwise, and the body draws its confidence from evidence rather than from theory. Vaelor had understood this about himself for a decade. He had worked against it methodically, seeking out the adversaries who genuinely threatened him, the problems that didn't resolve easily, the situations where his training was insufficient and required extension. He had done this because a king who stops being challenged by difficulty eventually loses the ability to respond to it. He had thought he was prepared for new information. He had not been prepared for information that placed the threat inside the palace itself, not in the East Wing, not behind an enemy's flag, but within the ring of men he had chosen, trained, and trusted with his proximity. Because that was what Oria's document implied, and he had known it since the fourth reading, and he had been letting himself approach it sideways for the past hour rather than looking at it directly. Someone had told the Shorn where the tether was vulnerable. Someone had told them the timing. The observatory message had arrived with information that assumed knowledge of the bond's formation, specific, technical knowledge that was not publicly available. The cathedral event had been witnessed by 2,000 people, but the mechanism of the bond, the celestial tether and its vulnerabilities, that was not information those 2,000 witnesses possessed. That was Oria's information. Observatory information, which meant the leak was not from the council. It was from somewhere much closer to the thing being protected. He went to bed at 3 in the morning and did not sleep. At 5, he rose and went to the lower vault. The interrogation room below the palace's east foundation was not a comfortable space by design. Stone walls, one lamp, a table and chairs that had been down here for 30 years and showed it. Vaelor had been in this room 4 times before in his reign, twice as the questioner, twice observing, and each time he had found its utility in its honesty. There was nothing in this room pretending to be something else. That quality, he had found, was clarifying for everyone who entered it. The man at the table was 35 or thereabouts, compact and weathered, with the specific fitness of someone who has been doing dangerous physical work for a long time. His right arm was bandaged from the shoulder down. Seraphina's work, from the night of the attack, the arm he'd had raised when she made her choice about what kind of damage to do. He was not visibly afraid. He was something more complex than afraid. He had the expression of a man who has decided to do a specific thing and is now in the process of executing that decision, regardless of what it costs. Vaelor sat across from him. Seraphina sat to Vaelor's right. The man looked at her. "My name is Corin," he said. Not to Vaelor, to her. "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear, and I'm telling you anyway because the alternative is worse." "Then tell me," Seraphina said. Corin looked at Vaelor once. A quick, assessing look. The look of a man calculating how much of what he says is going to survive the reaction. And then looked back at Seraphina. "The Shorn didn't contract with Solvain," he said. "Solvain contracted with the Shorn. There's a difference. Solvain wanted you eliminated. The Shorn agreed to help because it served their timeline. Solvain paid them in information." He paused. "The information was about the bond, where it was vulnerable, what was needed to reach it. Solvain didn't have that information," Vaelor said. "No." Corin's eyes stayed on Seraphina. "He got it from someone who did. The silence in the room was the kind that has weight." Vaelor felt something move through the bond, not from him to her, but from her to him, which still happened rarely enough that he noticed it every time. What it carried was not fear and not grief, but something that preceded both. The specific sensation of a person who has known, below conscious thought, that a thing was coming and is now experiencing the arrival of the confirmation they hoped to avoid. "Who?" she said. Her voice was flat, controlled in the way that control costs something. The old woman, Corin said. At the observatory. The name hit the room like a change in temperature. Vaelor did not move. He watched Seraphina's face. He had become, over 3 weeks, a careful student of her face. Not because he was looking for weakness, but because her face was one of the few places where what she actually was showed up without management. What he saw now was the specific devastation of betrayal that comes from a direction you never thought to armor. She had spent 2 hours with Oria the night before, listening to the woman describe her mother's training, her grandmother's sacrifice, the long chain of women who had tried and failed before her. She had put her hand over Vaelor's in a room lit by an old woman's lamp and allowed herself, for the first time in his presence, something that looked like the beginning of not being entirely alone. Oria. You're certain, Vaelor said. I carried the message myself, Corin said. 3 weeks ago, before the wedding. Oria contacted Solvain through a cutout in the merchant quarter. She provided a document, technical, detailed, describing the tether's formation and its vulnerabilities. Solvain shared it with the Shorn. The Shorn used it to calibrate their approach. He looked at Seraphina. She has been corresponding with the Shorn for longer than that. I don't know how long. I only know the one message I carried. Why are you telling me this? Seraphina said. Corin was quiet for a moment. Because I have a daughter, he said. 8 years old. And I looked at what the Shorn are planning to do to you, and I thought... He stopped, recalibrated. I thought that if someone was going to do that to my daughter, I would want someone to say something. The room was silent for a long time. Vaelor stood up. You'll be moved to a secure location, he said to Corin. You and your family. Tonight. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He walked out. Seraphina followed. They were in the corridor before either of them spoke. The corridor was lit by wall-mounted lamps at intervals, the spaces between them genuinely dark. And Vaelor walked through the light and the dark at the same pace, because pace was one of the things you controlled when the situation was not otherwise controllable. She knew everything, Seraphina said. Everything I told her last night. The awakening, the stage I'm at. What I need to get through the final transformation. Her voice was doing the thing it did when she was managing something very large, flatter than usual, stripped of texture, like a riverbed in dry season showing the shape of what the water normally covered. She used it. She's been using it, Vaelor said. The observatory wasn't a refuge, it was a collection point. Whoever she's been reporting to, the Shorn or something adjacent to them, has been gathering information about the celestial line for a century. She was the source. She trained my mother. Yes. She told me... Seraphina stopped walking. Vaelor stopped beside her. She was looking at the wall. Not at anything in particular. At the stone itself, the way people look at surfaces when what they're actually doing is internal and needs a neutral field to project against. Here is what betrayal does that violence cannot. Violence is external. It damages the body, sometimes the capacity, but it leaves the self intact as an adversary. Betrayal is internal. It requires, for its full effect, that the betrayed person had opened something, a door, a window, some small, deliberately unarmored place, and the betrayer had used that opening as an entry point. The damage is not to the flesh, it is to the aperture itself. Every subsequent opening becomes harder. Every subsequent trust requires more from the person granting it and costs more if it is misplaced. Seraphina had not been a person who opened easily. Vaelor had understood this from the beginning, had seen it in the quality of her self-sufficiency, the way she carried information close and released it only when she had assessed the cost and found it reasonable. She had been learning, slowly, to widen what she let him see. She had done it last night in the observatory, in the particular intimacy of sitting across from someone who knew the true shape of your history and watching him not leave. And the woman who made that possible had been feeding the enemy the entire time. What do you need? Vaelor said. She looked at him. Right now, he said. In this corridor. What do you need? She was quiet for a moment. To think, she said. Without the bond feeding me your reaction to my reaction to... She stopped. I need 10 minutes. Take them. He stepped back. Not far. 20 feet. The close formation distance he'd specified to Aldrich, the distance that kept the tether intact without being inside her processing space. He stood in the corridor and looked at the wall and gave her 10 minutes. They went to Oria at dawn. Not with an army, with Aldrich and 2 men, moving fast and quiet through the old city streets, while the morning vendors were just beginning to open their stalls, and the light was the particular pale gold of early sun on old stone. Vaelor had spent the walk deciding how to do this. Not the operational components, those were simple, but the calculus of what he wanted from the encounter and whether wanting it was a mistake. He wanted to understand why. This was not a strategic requirement. The information Corin had provided was sufficient for action. He didn't need Oria's motivation to deal with the threat she represented. But he had found, in 32 years, that understanding why people made the choices they made was the difference between solving a current problem and creating the conditions for the next one. A trader whose motivation you understand is a managed variable. A trader whose motivation you don't understand is a recurring threat in different forms. He also, and this he acknowledged to himself without apology, because he had stopped very early in his life apologizing for the things he actually was, wanted to know for Seraphina. Not to make it easier. It would not be easier regardless of the answer. But she deserved to understand the shape of the thing that had been done to her. The observatory door was unlocked, same as the night before. Oria was at her desk. She looked up when they entered, and her face, old and careful, and carrying the accumulated composure of a century's worth of difficult decisions, did something that Vaelor had not expected. It didn't close. It opened, just slightly, just enough. She looked at Seraphina. "You know," she said. "Tell me why," Seraphina said. Oria was quiet for a moment. The instruments around them ticked and breathed with their slow mechanical life, and the morning light came through the upper windows in angled bars, and the room had the same inhabited warmth as the night before, which felt now like a layer of something that had always been false. "The Shorn offered the line a survival," Oria said finally. "Not this line, not you. The line itself, the knowledge, the capacity, the accumulated understanding of 6 generations of women. They offered to carry it forward after the last one burned out." She looked at her own hands. "Every celestial I trained died in their awakening. Everyone. The power consumed them before they could learn to hold it. I watched it happen 6 times. 6 women I trained from childhood, and every one of them." She stopped. "The Shorn said they could preserve the essence, that what was lost in those deaths didn't have to be lost. They said if I helped them understand the mechanism, they could build something that lasted." "They lied to you," Seraphina said. "I know that now." "You knew it before," Seraphina said. Her voice was not raised. It was something colder than raised. The specific flat temperature of a person speaking from below their anger, from the place where anger has been sitting for long enough that it has become architecture. "You have been here for 100 years. You have read everything written about the Shorn. You knew what they did to every celestial they reached." Oria did not answer. "You chose to believe something that made it possible to do what you were going to do anyway," Seraphina said. "Because you were tired of watching them die and someone gave you a story that meant you didn't have to feel responsible for the next one." A pause. "That's not grief. That's surrender." The old woman looked at her, and what was in her face was not defiance. It was not the armor of a person who has made peace with a choice. It was something worse than both. The raw face of someone who knows exactly what they did and has been living inside that knowledge for long enough that it has become the walls of the place they exist. "I sent the message before I met you," Oria said quietly. "Before I knew what you were. I thought—" "It doesn't matter what you thought," Seraphina said. "It matters what you did." Vaelor stepped forward. "Where are the Shorn positioned?" he said, flat, directional. Oria looked at him. "Every piece of information you give me now," he said, "is the only leverage you have left. You will tell me everything. You will tell me where they are, how many, what their approach looks like, and what they know about the bond that I don't. And you will do it in the next 20 minutes, because after that I stop being interested in what you can offer and start being interested exclusively in containment." It was not a threat in the theatrical sense. It was information delivery. That was what made it land the way it did. The complete absence of performance. The flat factual register of a man who has already made the calculation and is now simply communicating the result. Oria talked. She talked for 30 minutes. and what she said was worth the cost of hearing it. The Shorn were not an army in the traditional sense. They were 50, perhaps 60 individuals, but each one carrying a fragment of celestial harvested capacity from the attacks of the past 3 centuries. Individually, manageable. Collectively, something his military had no current framework for engaging. Their approach would not be from the east. It would be from beneath, through the old city's subterranean infrastructure, the pre-Empire tunnels that predated every map his architects had drawn, following the resonant signature of the bond directly to its source. They were already in the city. They had been in the city for 6 days, and they were going to move on the 3rd night from now, not the 9th day. The 9th day was the completion of their formation. The attack was the 3rd night, 6 days. He had been given 9, and he had 3. Vaelor looked at Aldrich. Aldrich looked back with the face of a man making a very fast calculation. "The tunnels," Vaelor said. "I'll have every entrance identified within 4 hours," Aldrich said. "We can collapse them. Collapsing them moves the approach. It doesn't eliminate it. We need them underground, contained in a space we control when we engage." He looked at the map on Oria's wall, the pre-Empire city layout, far more detailed than anything in his official archives. "Can I take this?" Oria said nothing. He took it. He turned to Seraphina, who had not spoken since her last sentence to Oria, who was standing with the contained stillness that he now knew cost her something to maintain, who was processing 3 simultaneous catastrophes: the betrayal, the new timeline, and whatever the bond was doing between them in response to the heightened situation, and doing it in the specific silence of a person who refuses to let the processing become spectacle. 3 days, he said. "I know." "The awakening." "I know," she said again. Quiet, not sharp. The tone of someone who needs the conversation to be over because continuing it doesn't change the facts, and the facts require action. He looked at her for a moment. "We go back," he said. "I have 4 hours of tunnel mapping to do before I can sleep. You should sleep." "I'm not going to sleep." "I know, sleep anyway." Something crossed her face that was not quite amusement and not quite grief, but occupied the space between them. The reaction of someone who recognizes, from a direction they didn't expect, something that functions like being cared for. She walked to the door. He followed. Behind them, Oria sat at her desk in the observatory she'd occupied for a century, surrounded by the instruments she'd maintained in service of a purpose that had become something she wouldn't recognize if she stood outside it and looked honestly. She did not call after them. She did not offer more. She sat with what she'd done in the room where she'd done it, and the morning light continued to fall through the upper windows in the same angled bars, indifferent to what they illuminated. The next 3 days were the hardest of Vaelor's reign, and his reign had included a civil war. He mapped the tunnels. He repositioned the military not at the palace perimeter, but in the tunnel network itself. In the specific configuration that required the Shorn to engage on ground he controlled rather than ground they'd chosen. He suspended 2 additional council members, Payne and Cashin, with evidence now sufficient to make the suspensions hold, and absorbed the political cost of that action without flinching. He managed the Eastern dispatches, the ongoing Solvane investigation, the foreign delegations who had traveled for the political alliance and were now receiving a different empire than the one they'd expected. He slept 4 hours a night and did not complain about it. Seraphina worked beside him, not as a consort, not as an asset, not as a protected resource, as a person with relevant capacities and the willingness to use them, who happened to also be carrying a personal devastation and was doing so with the same quality of contained endurance she brought to everything else. She mapped the old texts against the tunnel configuration. She identified 3 approach corridors that Aldrich's team had missed. She spent 6 hours with the military commanders explaining, in the flat, precise language she used for technical information, what happened to a person in proximity to an uncontrolled celestial release, and what the soldiers needed to do to stay outside the damage radius. She did not discuss Oria. Vaelor did not bring it up. But on the second night, at 2 a.m, when they were both in the map room going over the final tunnel positioning, and the palace had gone quiet around them, and the only sound was the scratch of Seraphina's pen annotating the pre-Empire city layout, she said without looking up, "She told me I looked like my mother." Vaelor was quiet. "I believed her," Seraphina said, still not looking up. still annotating. It made me believe the rest of it, which is, she paused, which is exactly how it was designed to work. I know that. I know it was designed. It doesn't make it smaller. No, he said, it doesn't. I need you to know, she said. And now she did look up, and her face was the truest he had ever seen it. Not managed, not performing anything, just the actual face of a person saying the actual thing, that what she did to me is not going to make me worse at this. I need you to know that, because I can feel you deciding how much to protect me from the next thing, and I need you to stop. He looked at her across the table. If you slow down your operational decisions, she said, because you're accounting for my emotional state, we will lose. And we cannot lose this. A beat. Do you understand me? He did. He also understood something else, which was that the woman across this table from him was not asking him to stop caring about her. She was asking him to trust that she was strong enough to carry what she was carrying without being managed around it. Those were different requests, and the difference mattered. Understood, he said. She held his gaze for one more second. Then she went back to the map. On the third day, at dusk, the bond changed. Not gradually. Not the incremental deepening that Vaelor had been tracking since the wedding. The slow accumulation of awareness and resonance, and the particular mutual gravity of two people who had been pressed together by circumstance and found, against the available evidence, that they fit. This was different. This was a shift in frequency, sudden and total, like a string reaching its full tension. He felt it from across the palace. He was in the armory reviewing the final weapons positioning with Aldrich when it happened, and he stopped mid-sentence, and Aldrich looked at him, and he said, "The East Wing," and walked there without completing the sentence. He found Seraphina in the corridor outside her chambers. She was standing very still, and the light in the hallway was behaving incorrectly. The wall sconces flickering in a pattern that had nothing to do with draft, the shadows moving slightly against the direction of the light sources. Her hands were at her sides, and her eyes were open, and she was breathing in the way that means you are managing something large with a very narrow channel. "It's starting," she said. "I know. It's not supposed to start until..." The timeline moved. He reached her, stopped at arm's length. "What do you need?" "I don't know," she said, and it was the first time he had heard those words from her with no management in them at all, just the raw admission of a person at the edge of what their preparation has equipped them for. The light in the hallway pulsed. Somewhere beneath them, deep in the old city's bones, something that had been waiting for a century registered the pulse and moved toward it. The Shorn were not waiting for 3 days. They were here. And the only thing standing between what they would harvest from Seraphina and the end of everything Oria's 6 generations had built was an Alpha King who had just realized, with the particular clarity that only arrives at the moment when calculation becomes insufficient, and something older than strategy takes over, that he was not going to make a political decision about what happened next. He was going to make a different kind of decision entirely, one that, once made, could not be walked back by any law or treaty or crown that had ever existed. He took her hand. The bond ignited between them like a forge catching. And beneath the palace, the Shorn felt it, felt the tether burning hot and deliberate and defended. And the ones at the front of the tunnel formation hesitated, just for a moment, just long enough for Vaelor's men, positioned in the dark, to close the exits behind them. The bond burned between their joined hands like a coal that had been waiting decades for enough oxygen to become what it actually was. Vaelor felt it move through him in a wave, not painful, not pleasurable, something that preceded both those categories the way a storm front precedes rain. Information, pressure, the specific weight of a tether operating at full load for the first time, carrying between two people the combined mass of everything they had not yet said and everything they had already done, and the particular charge that builds between proximity and restraint when both have been maintained too long. Seraphina's breathing steadied, not because the awakening stopped, because something in the bond gave her a channel for it, a place the energy could move through rather than accumulate in. The light in the hallway still misbehaved, shadows still pulled against their sources, but Seraphina's face changed from the raw edge of losing ground to the harder expression of someone who has found footing they didn't expect and is deciding whether to trust it. She looked at their joined hands, then at him. "They're in the tunnels," she said. "My men have the exits closed." "That won't hold them." It doesn't need to hold them. He turned toward the corridor that led to the lower passages. It needs to hold them for 11 minutes. She moved with him without asking why 11 minutes, which he noted because it meant she had already understood what he'd built down there and trusted the construction. They ran. The lower passages of the palace were not built for speed. They were built for the movement of supplies and staff, narrow and stone-floored and lit at intervals by wall torches that threw as much shadow as light. Vaelor knew every turn from memory. He had walked these passages more times than he'd walked the formal corridors above, because the formal corridors were where you performed being king, and the passages below were where you actually moved through the building you governed. He pulled Seraphina through a left turn, a right, a descent of 14 steps into the sub-foundation level where the palace's stone met the city's older bones. He could hear the shorn. Not with his ears, not yet. With the bond, which was picking up Seraphina's awareness of them the way a tuning fork picks up the resonance of its match. They were below and ahead, moving fast now that the formation had been disrupted, abandoning the slow, careful approach for something more urgent, and the urgency told him they understood what the 11 minutes meant. "Talk to me," he said, not breaking pace. "There are more than 60, she said. Her voice was tight with effort. She was running and managing the awakening simultaneously, which was two things that did not combine cleanly. The number Aurea gave us was wrong, deliberately wrong. I can feel them. The resonance." A breath. "There are closer to 90. He filed that. 90 versus the 40 soldiers he'd positioned in the tunnel network. The math was not good, but math was not the only variable. They reached the sub-foundation junction, a chamber where 3 tunnel systems intersected, pre-Empire stonework on all sides, the air cold and mineral-smelling and carrying the particular quality of spaces that have been underground for centuries without anyone deciding to change them. Aldrich was there with 8 soldiers, torches mounted to iron brackets on the walls. The specific controlled readiness of men who have been waiting in a confined space for an enemy they've been told is coming. Aldrich looked at their joined hands. He said nothing about it. 90, Vaelor said. Aldrich absorbed this with the face of a man updating a calculation in real time. The northern exit collapsed on schedule. Eastern collapsed 6 minutes ago. We have them in the primary tunnel, approximately 200 yards out. And the position teams. In place. They're waiting on your signal. Vaelor looked at the tunnel mouth ahead of them. A low arch of black stone, the darkness beyond it absolute and moving with the specific quality of darkness that contains people. He could hear them now, not with the bond, but with his actual ears, the sound of massed movement in a confined space, footfalls and breath, and the faint resonance of 50 to 90 individuals carrying harvested celestial capacity and directing it at a point ahead of them with the collective focus of something that has wanted a single thing for a very long time. Here is what he had built in the tunnels over 3 days, working with his engineers in the hours after Aurea's information had reorganized his understanding of the threat. Not a trap, exactly. Traps implied passivity. You built them and waited for the target to fall into them. What he'd built was a funnel. Every exit collapsed or controlled, every branch of the tunnel system managed. The Shorn's approach channeled into a single corridor that ended here, in this junction, where the geometry was his rather than theirs. He had done this before, with armies, on open ground. The principle was identical. Deny the enemy the ability to choose their ground, and they stop being an enemy to fight and become a problem to process. The difference was that this particular problem, when it arrived in this junction, would require Seraphina to do something none of her predecessors had survived. He looked at her. "The awakening," he said. "When it peaks, what does it need from you?" She was quiet for 2 seconds, which was long for her. "Surrender," she said. That's the word Aurea used. Every celestial who burned out in the final stage fought it, tried to contain it. The power accumulated faster than they could manage it, and she stopped. "I need to let it move through me instead of trying to hold it. Surrender to it. Without losing myself in it." She met his eyes. "Those are not the same instruction." "No," he said. "They're not." The sound from the tunnel was closer. The air in the junction changed. Pressure dropping, temperature rising, the specific atmospheric disruption of a large quantity of something moving fast through a small space. Seraphina, her name in his mouth, and her eyes on him, and the bond doing between them what it had been building toward for 3 weeks. I'm not going to lose my grip on your hand. She looked at him. Whatever happens in there, he said, I'm not letting go. Whatever that costs. Whatever it requires from me on the other side. A beat, in the flat direct register he used for information that needed to land without decoration. You're not doing this alone. Something moved through her face. The same structural thing he'd seen outside the palace gate 2 days ago, the thing that was not warmth but occupied the space where warmth becomes load-bearing. She tightened her grip on his hand. Not gently. With the specific pressure of someone accepting the terms of a thing they have decided to trust. Signal your men, she said. He looked at Aldrich. Aldrich raised his arm and brought it down. From the tunnel, from both branch points they'd retained, 40 soldiers moved simultaneously, not toward the Shorn, but around the junction's perimeter, creating a contained ring rather than a forward engagement. The strategy was not to fight through 90 Shorn in a tunnel. The strategy was to give Seraphina a contained geometry in which to do what she needed to do, with the ring of soldiers as the outer boundary preventing dispersal. The Shorn came through the tunnel mouth 30 seconds later. They came in a mass, not the disciplined formation of trained soldiers, but the surge of something driven by a single collective purpose, which was in its own way more dangerous because it didn't hesitate the way individual judgment hesitates. They were not uniformly shaped or uniformly aged. Men and women both, dressed in the practical dark of people who have been living underground and moving at night. What distinguished them from ordinary people was not physical. It was the quality of their presence, the way the air around them distorted slightly, the way the torchlight caught the edges of them and bent wrong. The accumulated harvested capacity of 3 centuries of celestial devastation expressed as a kind of sustained wrongness in the space they occupied. The one at the front was tall and gray-haired, moving with the particular economy of someone who has been doing difficult things for a very long time. He stopped when he saw Vaelor and Seraphina in the center of the junction. He looked at their joined hands. He looked at the soldiers ringing the space. His expression shifted from urgency to something more complex. The expression of a man recalibrating, finding a situation that doesn't match his intelligence, deciding how to respond to new information. You knew we were coming, he said. His voice was even. This, Vaelor thought, was the voice of the Shorn's leadership. Careful, measured, not theatrical. More dangerous for that. For 6 days, Vaelor said, and you stayed. This is my empire. This is a building, the man said. The empire is what we're offering you. He looked past Vaelor to Seraphina, and his expression changed again. The way a person's expression changes when they are looking at something they have been waiting a very long time to see. You feel it. I know you do. The awakening. You know what it does to the ones who try to hold it alone. She's not alone, Vaelor said. A king with a sword and a tether, the man said, against what we carry. He spread his hands, a gesture that was almost reasonable. We're not your enemies. We've been preserving what your line produced for 300 years. Every celestial who burned out, we kept what was released. We kept it intact. We built something that doesn't have to die in its final stage. He looked at Seraphina again. Come with us. Complete the awakening in the container we've prepared. You don't have to be the 7th one who burns. Seraphina looked at him. You kept what was released, she said. Her voice was quiet and precise. From women who burned in their final stage. You kept it. A pause. You tore it out of them while they were dying, and you're calling that preservation. The man's expression did not change. That was its own answer. You killed them, Seraphina said. Not the awakening. You. Because an uncontrolled release produces more than a completed transformation. You needed them to fail. You've been making them fail. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the map table for 3 days, with the total attention of someone building an inventory. Oria's 6 generations, none of them had to die. You made sure they didn't survive. The silence in the junction lasted 4 seconds. Then the tall man moved, and the Shorn behind him moved with him, and the junction became something other than a space for conversation. Vaelor had been in fights before. He had been in battles, sieges, the specific close-quarters violence of palace coups and border skirmishes, and the one night 12 years ago when 3 men had come for him in the dark, and he had handled it with his hands because there had been nothing else available. He had always found, in those moments, that the conscious mind became secondary, not absent, but subordinate to something faster and older, the part of a person that processes threat and responds before the processing is complete. He let that happen now. He put himself between the advancing Shorn and Seraphina with the absolute economy of a man who has one job in this moment and knows it. He released her hand. Necessary, the sword needed both, and felt the loss of the direct bond connection register as a physical thing, a cut, manageable. She was 3 feet behind him. The bond still held across 3 feet. The first 3 Shorn who reached him were carrying the harvested capacity visibly. The air around their hands distorted. The floor under their feet cracked slightly with each step from the accumulated pressure of what they were containing. Vaelor engaged the nearest one before she completed her approach, not waiting for the strike, because waiting for the strike of someone with that kind of capacity advantage was how you died. Fast, close, taking the ground rather than defending it. The soldier's instinct. Offense when defense guarantees loss. The woman went down. Vaelor took something from the exchange, not from her capacity, which he had no mechanism to counter, but from her left hand across his right forearm, deep enough to register, not deep enough to compromise the arm's function. He noted it and kept moving. Behind him, he could hear Seraphina. Not hear her, exactly. Feel her, through the bond, which was operating at a higher frequency than he'd experienced. The awakening fully engaged now. Not the leashed thing from the corridor upstairs, but something that had been waiting for permission and had received it. The temperature in the junction rose. The torches flared and then extinguished simultaneously, leaving the space lit only by what Seraphina was producing. And what she was producing was not the controlled celestial light of the cathedral or the concentrated force of the East Wing. It was something larger, something that had no interest in being contained. Something that moved outward from her in all directions like the opening of a thing that has been closed too long. The soldiers on the perimeter held. Vaelor had told them what to expect. He had told them to plant their feet and keep their eyes up and trust the radius he'd given them, the distance beyond which the awakening's direct effects would be felt but not lethal. He did not know if they believed him. He knew they obeyed him, and in this situation obedience and belief produced the same result. The Shorn did not hold. The ones at the back of the formation felt the awakening's wave and broke left and right, scrambling for tunnel branches that Vaelor's positioned teams had closed, hitting stone and soldiers rather than exits. The ones in the middle of the formation felt it and pressed forward, toward Seraphina, because that was what they had come for, the harvest, and the proximity of the awakening in full progression was the specific thing they needed to be close to. Vaelor was in the middle of that forward press. He was aware in the specific way that a man is aware of things in extreme circumstances, not comprehensively, not cleanly, but in the quick inventory of the body under threat, that he was bleeding from 3 places now. The forearm, a cut above his left eye that was obscuring his vision on that side. Something along his ribs that was old and new simultaneously. The cathedral wound from 3 weeks ago reopened by impact and widened. He was aware that the pain was real and present, and that he was filing it under not yet rather than not important, which was a distinction with significant implications that he was choosing not to examine in the middle of a fight in a tunnel. The tall man, the leader, had not engaged the outer chaos. He was moving through it, past it, toward the center, toward Seraphina. Vaelor saw him. He made a choice. He stopped engaging the Shorn around him and moved directly toward the tall man, not intercepting, because the geometry was wrong for interception, but matching trajectory, closing the distance from the side, which put him on the man's right flank. At the moment, the leader was 3 feet from Seraphina and raising his hands with the specific positioning of someone who understood exactly where the tether was vulnerable and was positioning to sever it. Here is what Vaelor understood in that moment. Moving through the chaos of the junction, with blood in his left eye and his sword already committed to a line that would reach the man's raised right arm before the man's hands reached the severance point. Power, in its most honest form, is not about what you can do. It is about what you are willing to do. Every person who has ever held authority over anything has discovered this, that the ceiling of your capability is not set by your strength, but by the depth of your willingness, by how far down you can go before you find the place where you stop. He had spent 32 years believing he knew where that place was. He found out tonight that he had miscalculated. The place was lower, much lower, deeper than strategy, deeper than survival instinct, deeper than the carefully managed architecture of a man who had decided that emotional investment was a vulnerability he could not afford. The blade reached the leader's arm. The leader's hands did not reach the severance point. The man went down hard, and Vaelor was over him before he hit the floor. And what he said to the man, the words that came out in the flat command register he used for things that were not arguments but conclusions, was, "Don't get up." The leader looked up at him from the floor. His face was not theatrical in its pain. He was breathing hard and assessing the situation with the eyes of someone who has led difficult operations and understands when one has failed. "You can't hold all of us," the man said. "I don't need to hold all of you," Vaelor said. "I need to hold you." And behind him, the junction changed. He felt it through this bond before he turned. A shift in what Seraphina was doing, a change in the quality of the awakening's output that was different from anything he'd felt in 3 weeks of monitoring it through the tether. The large diffuse energy that had been moving outward in all directions found a center. It found a focus. It became, in the space of approximately 4 seconds, directional. The Shorn in the junction stopped, not all at once, in a wave from the center outward as the awakening's energy found them and did something that was not attack and not defense, but something between the two, something that interacted with the harvested celestial capacity they carried and produced. In the interaction, a result that no one in the room had experienced before. The harvested capacity began leaving them, not violently, not as extraction, more like the settling of something that had been held under pressure for a very long time and had finally found the pressure equalized. The distortion around the Shorn's hands faded, the wrongness in the air around them normalized. And what Vaelor saw in their faces, the ones close enough for him to see clearly, was not pain and not rage, but something more complex. The specific expression of people who have been carrying a weight for so long that they have forgotten what it feels like to not carry it, suddenly finding the weight gone and not knowing yet whether to grieve it or be grateful. The Shorn at the back of the formation, the ones who had been pressing against the closed tunnel exits, stopped pressing. 40 soldiers who had been holding positions against 90 opponents found the pressure simply stop, all at once, like a tide going out. Vaelor turned. Seraphina was in the center of the junction. She was the source of the light now, the entire junction lit by what was coming from her, warm and gold and immense. And she was standing with her arms at her sides and her eyes open, and he found the word only after a moment because the word surprised him. She was fine. She was present. She was herself, clearly and completely, in the middle of something that should by every available precedent have consumed her by now. And the reason she was herself was something he understood through the bond before he understood it consciously. She had done it. She had found the narrow passage between surrender and dissolution, had let the power move through her rather than fighting it, had held on to herself not by gripping, but by being so thoroughly herself that the current had no purchase on her identity, only on what she could release. Her eyes found his across the junction. He was bleeding from 3 places, and his left eye was half obscured, and he was still holding his sword, and the leader of the Shorn was on the floor at his feet, and around them 40 soldiers and 70-odd Shorn were standing in various states of arrested motion in the wake of something none of them had been prepared for. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you are checking that they are still there. He looked back the same way. "Hold," he said to his soldiers. His voice was loud enough to carry the junction. "Nobody moves." Nobody moved. The tall man on the floor said quietly, "That's not possible." "Which part?" Vaelor said. "Any of it." He was looking at Seraphina. "They all burned, every one of them, 3 centuries. It's not—" He stopped, restarted. "How?" "She's not alone," Vaelor said. The same words he'd said at the beginning of this, but they meant something different now. At the beginning, they'd been a statement of position. Now they were a statement of fact. The man was quiet. Vaelor stepped back from him and crossed the junction to Seraphina, because the distance between them had become, in the past 11 minutes, a variable he was no longer willing to let be larger than it needed to be for operational reasons. He reached her. The bond, at full contact, was incandescent. She looked at the blood on his face, his arm, his side, with the careful inventory of someone who has been peripherally tracking his condition through the bond and is now verifying it visually. "You need a healer," she said. "I need about 11 things," he said. "A healer is on the list." Something crossed her face that was not quite amusement, same as it never quite was, but occupied that space. "The Shorn. Their capacity is depleted. They're not a military threat in their current state." He looked at the junction, at his soldiers, at the Shorn now largely motionless in the aftermath of the harvest release, at Aldrich moving through the space with the systematic efficiency of a man taking stock. "We'll process them. The ones who engage directly, I want contained. The ones at the perimeter." He looked at the faces of the Shorn nearest him, the ones who had been pressing against exits. Some of them may not have chosen this. "They're not all true believers," she said. "I felt it when the capacity released. Some of them have been carrying it for years without knowing what it was or how to put it down." He looked at her. "That changes the processing." "It changes a lot of things." Aldrich reached them. He assessed Vaelor's injuries with the practiced speed of a man who has been managing his commander's physical damage for 12 years, decided it was survivable without immediate intervention, and moved on to the operational question. "We have 43 Shorn contained. Approximately 25 who were in the outer formation are unaccounted for. They made it back into the subtunnels before the teams could close. They'll surface somewhere," Vaelor said. "Post watchers at every tunnel exit in the old city. I want them found, not chased. Found and offered a choice before they're categorized as threats." Aldrich looked at him for a moment. "Offered a choice, my lord. Seraphina believes some of them were not there voluntarily." He met Aldrich's eyes. "She was right about the tunnel count, and right about Oria's number, and right about the approach vector. I'm going to keep assuming she's right until she's wrong." Aldrich absorbed this. "Yes, my lord." He moved off. The junction was beginning to process itself in the way that spaces do after violence, the soldiers shifting from combat readiness to the slower alertness of the aftermath, the Shorn who remained sitting or standing in various states of disorientation as what they'd been carrying for years settled out of them. The light from Seraphina had not gone. It was present still, quieter now, the ambient warmth of something that had expressed what it needed to express and was now simply being rather than performing. She was watching the Shorn who sat nearest her, a young woman with a cut on her forehead and the specific bewildered expression of someone who has just put down something very heavy and cannot fully remember why they were carrying it. The young woman looked up and met Seraphina's eyes. Neither of them spoke. But something moved between them in the space where language would have been inadequate anyway. The specific recognition that passes between people who have both been carrying versions of the same weight from different directions and have only just, in this moment, been able to set it down. Vaelor watched this. He thought about the empire above them, the council with its suspended members and its managed crisis, the eastern provinces with their newly mapped unrest, the foreign delegations waiting for the stable alliance they'd been promised, the administrative machinery of a continent-spanning state that ran on the fuel of consistent and credible authority. He thought about the work of the next weeks, the processing of 90 Shorn, the decision of what to do with the ones who had not chosen their involvement, the political cost of what had happened in this tunnel tonight, and how it would be received by every house that had been watching to see whether the king's new queen was an asset or a liability or something that didn't fit either category. He thought about Oria, sitting in the observatory with her century of choices, and the particular hell of knowing exactly the shape of what she'd done. He thought about Seraphina standing in the center of a junction lit by her own capacity, having done what 6 of her predecessors hadn't survived, having done it because she had found the right way to ask for help and the right person to ask it from, 2 facts that had arrived in the same unlikely package and had been decided in the end, not by strategy or calculation, but by the older and less governable thing that lives in every person below the level where strategy is formed. He was bleeding from 3 places, and he was in a pre-Empire tunnel at approximately 1 in the morning, and the Empire had just changed shape in ways he would spend the next decade managing. And he was aware, standing in the warmth of the bond and the light of the woman beside him, that he was, the word came without his approval, content. Not happy. Content was different. Content was the state of a person who has paid a significant price for something and has decided the price was correct. Seraphina turned to him. She looked at his injuries again. The forearm, the eye, the side. Vaelor, she said. It was the first time she had used his name without his title in front of it. He felt it register in the bond, not dramatically, not with the thunderclap of the cathedral or the incandescence of the tether at full load. Quietly. The way something registers when it was already true and has simply been confirmed. He looked at her. She was about to say something. He could tell. The specific quality of breath that precedes a sentence someone has been holding. And then Aldrich's voice from across the junction, tight and controlled in the way it only got when the information was bad. "My lord, you need to see this." He crossed to Aldrich in 6 strides. Aldrich was holding a dispatch. Not from the tunnel teams. The paper was dry, which meant it had come from above. From the palace. From a runner who had come down here rather than waited for Vaelor to come up. He read it. He read it twice. Same as the observatory document. Same 2 readings. Then he stood very still for a moment. Seraphina had followed. She was at his shoulder. "What?" He handed her the dispatch. It was from the council archive. From Doran, the chancellor, who had served 3 kings and survived by knowing exactly when to write things down without comment, and who had apparently decided tonight that this was the moment to break that pattern. The dispatch said, "Lord Solvain has been released from custody by order of 7 council members in joint session." The joint session was convened 1 hour ago under Emergency Statute 3, which permits council action without the Crown's presence in the event of a declared sovereign incapacity. The declared incapacity is the king's current location in the tunnel network, which 3 council members have characterized as evidence that he is operating under the influence of the queen's celestial capacity, and therefore cannot be considered to be acting with independent sovereign judgment. It said, "They have issued a warrant." It said, "Not for the king." Vaelor looked up from the dispatch. Across the junction, in the light that Seraphina had made, his soldiers and the remnants of the Shorn were beginning the slow work of the aftermath. Above them, 7 members of the council he had built had used the 40 minutes he'd been underground to do the thing he had not calculated for. Not Solvain's gambit, not the Shorn's approach, not Oria's betrayal. Something simpler and more permanent than any of those. They had used his absence to turn the law against her. Emergency Statute 3. Sovereign incapacity. 7 votes out of 14. Legal, documented. The kind of action that, once on the record, could not be unactioned without the king publicly overturning his own council's emergency authority, which created a constitutional crisis of a different and more durable kind than anything the Shorn had managed in a tunnel. Seraphina finished reading. She handed the dispatch back. She looked at him, and her face was the truest he had ever seen it. Past the management, past the containment, down to the actual bedrock of a person who has just found out that the fight is not over and that the next phase is not a fight she can win with celestial capacity or careful mapping or anything she has in her hands right now. "What does the warrant authorize?" she said. He told her. The word she said in response was quiet and undecorated and entirely accurate. Above them, 7 men were sitting in a council chamber with the law on their side and a document in hand that said the Queen of Varyndor was to be removed from the palace by crown authority until her celestial status could be assessed by an independent body they had appointed. Removal from the palace, away from the bond, away from the tether, into the custody of men whose most powerful member had sent assassins to her room 3 weeks ago. It was not a legal mechanism. It was an execution in the language of law. And in 11 minutes, the guard they had authorized would reach the tunnel entry points. Vaelor stood in the junction he had built to protect her, with 40 of his soldiers and 70 Shorn in various states of aftermath around him, bleeding from 3 places, holding a dispatch that told him the most dangerous thing that had ever come for her was not the Shorn below, it was the men above, using his own law. He folded the dispatch. He looked at Seraphina. "How much do you have left?" he said. "After what you just did." She looked at him steadily. "Enough." Because what I'm about to do, he said, is going to require everything we both have, and it is going to take something from this empire that it will not get back. And I need you to understand that I know that, and I am doing it anyway. And the reason I am doing it has nothing to do with strategy. She held his gaze. In the bond which was warm and vast and absolutely present between them, he felt her understand what he was saying. Not the words. The thing under the words. The thing that 32 years of calculated emotional quarantine had been building pressure behind, and that the past 3 weeks had been systematically dismantling, and that tonight in this tunnel had finally irrevocably become something he could not pretend was anything other than what it was. Vaelor, she said. Same as before. Same quiet confirmation of a truth that was already there. I know, he said. He turned to Aldrich. Get everyone moving, he said. We're going up. Above them, the council chamber waited. 7 men with a warrant and the weight of law behind them. Below, an Alpha King who had spent 32 years choosing the Empire over everything else had just made a different choice. And the Empire was about to find out what happened when the man who built it decided that the law he'd inherited was no longer sufficient for what he was willing to protect. They came up from the tunnels, the way armies come back from the kind of fight that changes the people who survived it. Not in formation, not in the dress of a managed return, but in the honest condition of what had actually happened. Torchlit and bloodied and moving with the specific gravity of men who have been in a confined space with something they didn't fully understand and have come out the other side still vertical. Vaelor came up first. He had his sword sheathed, a deliberate choice, not because the night was over, but because what was coming next was not a fight you won with a sword, and the sheathed blade communicated that to every eye that would find him in the next 60 seconds. The forearm was wrapped with a strip torn from a soldier's undershirt, functional rather than clean. The cut above his left eye had mostly closed on its own, in the way that head wounds do when they are less severe than they look. The ribs were the worst of it. Each breath a specific reminder, not incapacitating, simply present in the way that pain is present when you have decided it is not the most important thing in the room. Seraphina came up beside him. The light she carried was quieter now. Contained, ambient, present in the way that warmth is present in stone that has been in the sun. It did not announce. It simply was. Her dress from the tunnel was dark with dust and old moisture from the pre-Empire stone. Her hair had come fully loose somewhere in the junction, and there was a bruise at her wrist where someone had grabbed and she had broken the grab. She had not fixed any of it. There was nothing in her bearing that suggested she thought any of it needed fixing. This, Vaelor had come to understand, was not carelessness. It was precision. She knew exactly how she looked. She had decided that the way she looked tonight was not something to manage away. The corridor outside the tunnel entrance was the long passage that ran beneath the palace's east administrative wing, the wing that housed the council chamber and the legal archive and the offices of the men who had, 40 minutes ago, used the machinery of the empire Vaelor had built to produce a warrant with his queen's name on it. Aldrich moved up to flank. The council guard will be at the east stair, Vaelor said. Yes. Aldrich's voice had the specific quality it got when he was managing multiple variables simultaneously and had ranked them by urgency. Approximately 12 men, dispatched under the warrant authority. They'll have documentation. I know what they'll have. My lord, the statute, I know what the statute says. Aldrich was quiet for 2 steps. Then, what are we doing? Vaelor looked at the corridor ahead. Torches at intervals, the administrative passage wider than the tunnel network, built for the movement of people with places to be, rather than the movement of supplies. The east stair was 200 feet ahead and to the left, and beyond it was the council chamber. And in the council chamber were 7 men who had done something they believed the law authorized, and were therefore not, in their own accounting, doing anything wrong. That was the specific difficulty of what was ahead. Not that the men were evil, that they were, by the terms of the law as written, correct. Emergency Statute 3 was real. Its application was technically valid. The sovereign was underground in an active situation. 7 members had convened. The declaration had been made. The warrant issued. Every step of the process had been followed. Every document would hold up to scrutiny from any legal mind in the empire. There was no argument that operated in the language of the existing law, which meant what was coming was not an argument. "We're going to the council chamber," Vaelor said, "and I'm going to dissolve it." Aldrich did not react immediately. He was a man who had served this king through 3 campaigns and 1 coup attempt, and his particular form of loyalty was not unconditional agreement. It was the specific loyalty of a person who trusts the judgment of the man he serves enough to follow, even when the course looks irreversible. "That is a permanent action," Aldrich said. "I know. The council has existed for 200 years, dissolving it without cause established in the charter. The cause is in the tunnel behind us," Vaelor said. 90 shorn, 6 dead, and a warrant issued by men who used my absence to do what they couldn't do while I was present. He looked at Aldrich. "That is cause." Aldrich looked at him for a moment. "Yes, my lord." They kept walking. The council guard found them at the east stair, as predicted. 12 men in the formal livery of the imperial household, armed, standing in the position of men who have been given an order they believe is legal and are now doing the thing that legal orders require, which is executing them regardless of what they personally think about the circumstance. The sergeant at the front of the 12 was a man named Breck, whom Vaelor had personally promoted 3 years ago from the palace watch because his judgment under pressure was reliable. Breck looked at Vaelor's injuries. He looked at Seraphina. He looked at the 40 soldiers and the assorted shorn following at distance. His face did the mathematics of the situation and arrived at an answer that he did not appear to enjoy. "My lord," Breck said, "I'm carrying authorization under Emergency Statute 3. "I know what you're carrying," Vaelor said. "Stand aside." Breck did not move. "My lord, the order was issued by 7 men who convened without quorum, without notification to the throne, and without the presence of the Lord Chancellor, who is required by the Charter to attend any emergency session regardless of its basis." He watched Breck process this. "Doran was not present at that session. Check the documentation." Breck looked at his documentation. The silence lasted 4 seconds. The Lord Chancellor's required presence was a detail that the 7 council members had apparently not verified carefully enough. Doran, who had served 3 kings and survived by understanding exactly when to be somewhere and when to absent himself, had either been excluded intentionally or had removed himself with the precise awareness of a man who knew what he was and was not willing to put his seal on. Breck stepped aside. His 11 men stepped aside with him. Vaelor walked up the east stair. There is a quality that belongs to certain moments in history. Not the moments that are loudest, not the battles or the proclamations, but the quieter moments where a decision gets made that rearranges everything built on top of the assumption it replaces. These moments are rarely recognized as they happen. The people inside them feel the weight of what is occurring, but not always its full shape, because the full shape requires the vantage of aftermath to see clearly. What they feel is simpler and more immediate. The specific sensation of a thing becoming irreversible, of a door being passed through that does not exist on the other side. Vaelor felt this on the east stair. He felt it in the way the bond registered Seraphina beside him, present, steady, carrying the warmth of the awakening's aftermath and the harder weight of everything the night had cost, and in the way his body was making its honest accounting of the damage sustained, and in the way the word dissolve sat in his chest with its full permanence. He was not performing composure. He was not managing his reaction for an audience. He was simply a man who had made a decision and was now walking toward its execution. The council chamber doors were closed. He opened them. The 7 men inside looked up simultaneously, and what moved through the room was not quite fear and not quite defiance, but the compound expression of men who had done something they believed in and are now confronted with the person that something was done to and are recalculating. Sylvain was not there. He was still being processed through the formal release the warrant had authorized, somewhere in the palace's administrative section. But Payne was there, and Cassian was there, and 5 others whose names Vaelor had known for a decade, and whose faces he could read the way he read campaign maps. For the information they were trying not to give, Lord Payne spoke first. He was good at speaking first. It was his primary strategy in every meeting. Establish the frame before anyone else could. "Your Majesty." Measured, careful, wearing the specific authority of a man who has the documentation on his side. The council convened under legal authority. The emergency statute requires the Lord Chancellor was not present, Vaelor said. Payne stopped. The charter requires his presence for a valid emergency session. Vaelor moved to the head of the table. Not his usual chair. He did not sit. He stood at the head, which was a different thing. The session was invalid. The warrant is void. The charter's requirement for the Chancellor is procedural, Cassian said from the far end, finding his voice. Procedural requirements can be waived. By the Crown, Vaelor said, not by the Council. The waiver authority resides with the Sovereign, not with the body that convenes. He looked at Cassian. You know this. You were on the legal review committee that confirmed this interpretation 4 years ago. Cassian looked at his hands. Lord Payne's composure remained but changed quality. The specific change of a man who has just understood that the legal ground he was standing on is not as stable as he believed it to be. Your Majesty, Payne said. With respect, the concern the Council shares is not political. It is— I know what it is, Vaelor said. She is a celestial, Payne said. His voice was not unkind. That was the thing about Payne. He genuinely believed what he was saying, which made him both more dangerous and more comprehensible than men who were simply opportunistic. The power she carries. What happened at the wedding? What happened tonight? Whatever it was. There is no precedent for what she is in the imperial legal framework. There is no mechanism for assessing— There is now, Vaelor said. He reached into his coat and removed the document he had written 3 hours ago, before the Shorn came through the tunnel mouth, in the 40 minutes between reading Oria's dispatch and descending into the sub-foundation. He had written it at the map table with Seraphina's annotated pre-Empire City layout beside him and a candle burning low, and he had written it in the clear, flat, declarative language he used for legal instruments, and he had signed it. He placed it on the council table. The Imperial Recognition Act, he said, establishing the Celestial Bond as a sovereign instrument of the Crown, subject to no council review, no independent assessment, and no emergency statute application. The Crown's bonded partner is recognized as co-sovereign, with all privileges and protections thereof. He looked at the men around the table. It's signed. It enters the legal record as of this moment. Doran, who had positioned himself just inside the chamber door with the specific quiet of a man who had known he would be needed here and had therefore not gone far, stepped forward and received the document. Recorded, Doran said. He did not inflect this word. He did not need to. The room was silent. Seraphina had not spoken since they entered the chamber. She was standing 3 feet to Vaelor's right, which was her natural position in this room, and she was looking at the 7 men around the table with the full attention that she brought to everything, the inventory-building attention that made people feel both seen and honest. She was not performing composure. She was simply present in the way that she was always present, completely, without reservation, which was its own kind of force. Lord Payne looked at her for a long moment. You understand, he said, and his voice had lost its earlier frame, had become something more direct, that what I was trying to do was protect the Empire, not harm you. Seraphina looked at him. I understand that, she said. Her voice was quiet, not warm, but not cold either, the temperature of something honest. And I need you to understand that the Empire and I are not in opposition. We never were. What you were protecting the Empire from was a version of me that you built from fear and incomplete information. A pause. That version doesn't exist. Payne looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked at his hands. Vaelor let the silence hold for 3 seconds. Then, the Council is suspended pending reconstruction. Every member will be reviewed against the Charter requirements for impartiality and undivided loyalty to the Crown. Members who are cleared will be reconfirmed. Members who are not will be thanked for their service. He looked around the table. That process begins tomorrow. Tonight, everyone goes home. It was not a dramatic dismissal. It was an administrative one. That was, he had found, more permanent than drama. The men filed out. Payne stopped in the doorway. He looked at Vaelor. He looked at Seraphina. He looked at the 2 of them standing in a council chamber that smelled of old wood and candle smoke, in the wreckage of an Empire night, bloodied and standing. He said, I was wrong about her. He said it the way that certain men say difficult things, flatly, without apology in the theatrical sense, but with the weight of genuine reckoning. The statement of a man who has looked at the evidence and followed it to a conclusion he didn't prefer. Then he left. The chamber was empty except for Vaelor, Seraphina, Doran, and Aldrich. Doran looked at the document in his hands, then at the king and said, "I'll have this formally registered and circulated before dawn." "Thank you, Doran." Doran left. Aldrich looked at Vaelor's injuries one more time, looked at Seraphina, looked at the door. "I'll have a healer at your study in 20 minutes, he said. He left. The council chamber was very quiet. Vaelor looked at the table, at the document's absence, now in Doran's hands and moving toward the record. At the chairs the council had left in various states of pushed-back haste, at the candles burning in the wall sconces, consistent and indifferent. He looked at the head of the table where he had stood for 10 years running the machinery of the empire he'd inherited and rebuilt, and handed to the next decade in better shape than he'd received it. He thought about what Payne had said. "I was trying to protect the empire." He thought about the specific tragedy of that. Not the malice in it, which was limited, but the structural failure it represented. A man who loved the empire enough to use its mechanisms against the thing that would have strengthened it, because fear is always faster than understanding, and law is always more comfortable than the unknown. He had built that council. He had selected those men. He had created the conditions in which 7 of them could look at a woman who had just survived what no celestial before her had survived, and see a threat rather than a gift. That was not their failure alone. That was also his. Here is what 32 years of authority eventually teaches, if the person holding it is willing to learn. The shape of your blind spots is determined by the shape of what you have decided you already know. Vaelor had known, for 3 decades, that emotional investment created vulnerability. He had known it so thoroughly, had built so much architecture around it, that he had created a court in his own image. Men who prized control over understanding, calculation over connection. He had never intended this. He had simply been himself, consistently, and a court reflects the person at its center the way water reflects what's above it. He would rebuild it differently. He had already started. He turned to Seraphina. She was looking at him with the careful attention she always brought to things that mattered, and what he saw in her face was the full accounting of the night. The tunnel, the awakening, Oria's name still somewhere in her chest like a splinter that hasn't worked its way out yet, Payne's acknowledgement, the document that was now in the record. She was holding all of it. She was not collapsing under it. She was holding it the way she held everything, with the sustained and unperformable endurance of someone who has learned that the only way through a thing is through it. "Come here," he said. She crossed to him. They were standing close enough that the bond was operating in its quietest and most complete register. Not the incandescence of the tunnel or the thunderclap of the cathedral, but the particular warmth of proximity that has moved past the stage of significance and into something that simply is, the way breathing is, the way north is. She looked at his face, at the eye, the ribs, the wrapped forearm. With the inventory she'd been running on and off for 11 minutes. She raised her hand and touched the cut above his left eye with 2 fingers. Not healing. She didn't have that capacity. Just contact. The specific, deliberate contact of a person choosing to touch something that has been hurt. "You dissolved the council," she said. "Suspended. You'll rebuild it." "Yes." "With different criteria." "Yes." She looked at him. The amber eyes, the dust from the tunnel, the bruise at her wrist that was darkening toward something that would look worse tomorrow before it looked better, the loose hair and the dark coat and the quality of presence that had never, not once in 7 weeks, been anything other than entirely itself. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "In the tunnel," she said. "The final stage of the awakening. The reason I held on." She paused, and the pause had in it the texture of a person who is choosing precise language for something that precision might not fully serve. It wasn't the bond. Not only. The bond was the mechanism. But the reason... She stopped. "I knew you were there, specifically. Not just the tether. You. A beat. That's what held." He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about what it cost her to say that. He understood the cost because he knew exactly what it cost him to hear it. Not the effort of understanding it, but the effort of receiving it without immediately converting it to a variable in a larger calculation, which was the reflex of 32 years, and which he was, actively and with full consciousness, refusing. He said, "I know." She blinked. "I felt it," he said, "through the bond. both directions. He held her gaze. I know what held, and I know why. And I am done pretending that the reason is something I can quarantine into a part of myself that doesn't affect decisions. He paused. It affects decisions. You affect decisions. I have decided this is not a vulnerability. It is a vulnerability, she said. Everything worth anything is a vulnerability. He said it flat, not as poetry, as geometry. The Empire is a vulnerability. The men in that tunnel were a vulnerability. Trusting Aurea was a vulnerability and cost us something real. He looked at her. That's not an argument for having less of it. That's an argument for knowing what you're trusting and why. She was quiet. The candles in the council chamber continued their steady burning. Outside the window, the capital city was in the specific hour between deep night and early morning when the dark begins to thin at its edges, but is not yet committed to anything as definite as dawn. Somewhere below the palace, Aldrich was processing 90 shorn and 40 soldiers and the administrative aftermath of a tunnel fight. Somewhere in the old city, Aurea was sitting in the observatory with the shape of what she had done. Seraphina said, "What happens to her?" He knew who she meant. He had been waiting for this question and had not allowed himself to preemptively answer it, because the answer was hers to shape as much as his. "That depends," he said, "on what you want." She looked at him. "What I want and what justice requires are different." "Sometimes," he said, "not always." She was quiet for a moment. "She trained my mother," she said. "She watched 6 women burn. She spent a century in a building doing work she believed in, and somewhere in that century she got tired and someone offered her a story that let her betray the thing she'd given everything to." A pause. "That's not the story of a monster. That's the story of someone who broke at a specific place under a specific pressure." She looked at the window. "I don't forgive her. I'm not at the part of this where forgiveness is available yet, but I don't want her executed." "Containment," he said. "The observatory," she said. "Under watch. The knowledge she carries is still real. The harm she did doesn't erase what she knows." Her jaw tightened slightly. "She can spend the rest of whatever time she has being useful rather than being punished. Those aren't mutually exclusive." Vaelor looked at her. He thought about mercy as a political instrument, which was how he had always categorized it. A tool, applied with calculation, productive when deployed correctly. He thought about what he was watching in Seraphina's face right now, which was not that, which was something harder and more honest than mercy as instrument. Mercy as the decision of a person who has looked at the full shape of what was done to her and has decided that the most powerful response available is not the one that costs the most. Here is what genuine authority eventually learns to recognize, if it is honest with itself. The difference between strength and dominance. Dominance is external. It requires an audience, requires the subjugation of something or someone to demonstrate its own existence. Strength is internal. It requires nothing outside itself to be real. A person who can look at genuine betrayal and respond with something more complex than destruction is not displaying weakness. They are displaying the specific quality that separates a ruler from a tyrant, the capacity to be affected without being governed by it. Seraphina had that quality. She had always had it. He had been watching it since the cathedral. "It will be arranged," he said. She nodded. One small decisive movement. The subject was closed in the specific way she closed subjects, completely, returning the energy to the present rather than leaving it trailing. She looked at his ribs. "The healer Aldrich is sending," she said, "will actually be seen when they arrive." "Yes." "And you will not tell them it's manageable and dismiss them." "I might." "Vaelor." His name, again. Still quiet. Still doing what it had done the first time she used it without his title, landing in the bond and in his chest simultaneously as something that was not a claim but was something structural. Permanent in the way that certain things become permanent not through declaration but through repetition, through use, through the slow accumulation of moments in which someone has simply been called by their name and has come. He looked at her. She was looking at him with the expression that was not amusement and not grief but the space between them, and it was, he thought, the most complete thing he had ever seen on a person's face. Not performed, not managed, Not the face of someone doing something for an audience. The actual face of a person who has come through something very large and is now standing in the aftermath of it, and is looking at another person and is thinking, "You were there. You did not let go." "I'll see the healer," he said. She exhaled. A small thing. Real. They walked out of the council chamber together, through the corridor that smelled of old stone and administrative wood polish, through the east wing passage where the sconces were burning low, past the stair where Breck and his 12 men had stood with documentation and had stepped aside for a reason that was not fear, but something closer to the recognition that some things do not have adequate written language and must be evaluated by other means. The palace was quiet around them. The specific quiet of 4 in the morning in a building that has been through something and has not yet decided what to do with it. At the junction between the east wing and the main passage, Vaelor stopped. He stopped because the bond had done something. A specific shift, the kind that had no emotional content attached to it but was simply informational, simply present. The awakening had settled. Not gone. It was not going anywhere. It was part of her now in the way that was complete rather than active, the settled power of something that had finished becoming what it was. What he felt through the tether was the particular quality of water after a storm has moved through and the current has returned to its natural depth. Still strong, still real, clean. She had survived it. She had come through the final stage that 6 women before her hadn't come through, and she was standing in the east wing passage with dust on her coat and a bruise at her wrist, and she was entirely herself. He thought about the documents Doran was filing. The Recognition Act, unprecedented in 200 years of imperial legal history. The council's suspension. The new record being written for the archive that would sit in the history of Varyndor next to everything else this reign had produced. He thought about what the Empire would do with this information. The allied houses, the foreign delegations, the eastern provinces, the Shorn who had been contained in a tunnel and would now need to be accounted for, the 25 who had scattered into the old city's underground and would need to be found one at a time. He thought about the work of the next decade. Then he stopped thinking about it. Not because it wasn't real, because it could wait 3 minutes, because there was, occasionally, a cost to the discipline of constant forward management, and the cost was the specific toll of never fully arriving in the present moment. And the present moment, this one, in this corridor, with the bond warm between them and the city beginning to thin at the edges of its dark, was real and available and asking for nothing except to be inhabited. "The healer's going to have opinions about the ribs," he said. "Severe ones," she agreed. "I've had worse." "That is both true and not the point." He looked at her. She was already looking at him. "Seraphina," he said. She waited. He had, in 32 years, made many decisions. He had made them in battle and in council and in the private dark of his study, when the choices were between bad and worse, and the correct answer required accepting both costs simultaneously. He had made decisions that shaped the lives of thousands of people who would never know his name had touched theirs. He had never, once in all of that, made a decision that felt as clear as this one. He took her face in his hands, the unbandaged hand and the wrapped one, both because his hands were the only things available and they were what he had. She didn't move away. He kissed her. It was not the kiss of a political alliance. It was not a statement for an audience. It was the thing that it was. The culmination of 7 weeks of shared difficulty and chosen proximity and the slow, careful building of trust between 2 people who had both, by different routes, learned that trust was the most expensive thing in the world and had decided the cost was correct. She kissed him back. The bond between them did something that had no adequate description in the language of physical sensation or emotional vocabulary. Something complete and quiet and vast. Something that had been building since the cathedral and had finally, in this corridor at 4 in the morning, found its full expression. When they separated, she looked at him. Her eyes were amber and present and entirely clear. "The healer," she said. "The healer," he agreed. They walked on. Outside the palace, the capital of Varyndor was beginning its ordinary morning. The early vendors, the guard change, the gradual return of light to streets that had been dark all night. Inside the old city tunnels, Aldrich was managing the aftermath of something the history books would later describe in 3 different ways depending on who wrote them. In the observatory, An old woman sat with the weight of a century of choices and the particular silence of someone who is no longer being asked to carry what they took. In the imperial record, a document was being filed that had no precedent in 200 years. In a corridor of the East Wing, a king and his queen walked toward a healer in the ordinary and necessary work of recovery. It was not a triumphant ending, not in the theatrical sense, no crowd, no proclamation, no moment staged for the witnesses that history requires. What it was real. The specific realness of two people who have been through something genuine and have come out the other side, changed in ways they have not yet finished understanding, walking through a palace that has to be rebuilt now that the version they started in no longer exists. Here is what survives the collapse of everything you built your certainty on, what was real about you before you built it. Vaelor Draven had built 32 years of architecture on the premise that the self was best managed by reduction. Reduce the variables, reduce the exposure, reduce the number of things that had access to the parts of you that could be hurt, and what remained would be stable. He had been wrong about this in a specific and important way. What remained was not stable. It was merely protected, and protected things do not grow. He had grown more in 7 weeks than in the decade before them. He knew what the cost of that was. He would be paying it for years. In the rebuilt council, in the managed aftermath of the Shorn, in the slow and difficult work of reshaping an empire that reflected its ruler and would now have to adjust to a ruler who had been reshaped himself. It would not be easy. It would not be clean. Very little that was worth doing was either of those things. He had decided it was worth doing. He had decided this in a tunnel, in the dark, with his hand in hers and the Shorn at the perimeter and the awakening burning between them like a forge at full heat. He had not regretted it once since. The healer was waiting at the study door. Seraphina held the door open. The gesture was small and practical. He walked through it. Behind him, the door closed on the night that had changed the empire, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of a thing that knows what it is. And in the thinning dark outside, the capital's morning moved forward, carrying the ordinary and irreplaceable weight of everything that comes after.